The Marvel Cinematic Universe is debatably the most successful film series of all time. Now, some would argue that it's not really a series and more of a, well, universe, but regardless of your stance on that and your thoughts on the movies as a whole, you can't deny the massive impact that these films have had over the years. Almost all of them have been some of the most popular films of their respective years. They arguably defined pop culture throughout the 2010s, and the fact that most of them got positive reception is really admirable.
The thing is, most of that sentence was in past tense, because the most common thing you'll hear people say about the MCU nowadays is that it fell off.
I mean, the first 4 Avengers movies were some of the most anticipated films of all time. Hell, Endgame was probably the most, and now we have another Avengers movie coming out in December, and I have seen a grand total of 1 person say that they're excited for it. Now, personally, I've only ever been a casual fan of the MCU. Sure, there are individual films that I loved, but I've never been jumping up and down to see all of them. It's always just been, if I think they look interesting, or I hear good things, then I'll check them out, and if not, then I won't. Because of this, the only 2 I had seen until Infinity War came out were the first Avengers and Civil War, but after Infinity War came out, I decided to revisit the first one, and it held up a lot better than I was expecting. So I decided to check out some of the ones I missed, like the Guardians movie, Spider-Man Homecoming, Black Panther, and the next 2 Avengers movies. And since then, I've seen quite a few of them in theaters, but I've maintained my usual stance of only seeing the ones I'm interested in or hear good things about. But as time goes on, I keep hearing more and more people say it fell off after Endgame, and honestly, that got me curious. Are the movies of lesser quality, or are people just burnt out after so many years? Because I've enjoyed all of the ones I've seen since Endgame to some degree. Now again, I haven't seen all of them, but I also haven't seen a lot of the stuff pre-Endgame either. That is, until now. I finally decided to watch every single Marvel movie, and I'm going to be ranking all of them.
So, is the older stuff really better than the newer stuff, or are people just letting nostalgia get the better of them? Well, only way to find out, and that is to rank them all. Also, before we begin, I should just make this very clear, I have not seen any of the TV shows, and I did not feel the need to watch them because this took long enough as is. So while there are some aspects of the movies that go over my head, I still think I got the general picture of enough of them. Boo! You stink! Alright, and the award for the absolute worst Marvel movie of all time goes to, drumroll please, Eternals! This movie sucks!
I was pretty confident this would be at the bottom of the ranking, and yeah, I was completely right, because wow, this one was tough to get through. This has got to be one of the most boring movies I've ever seen in my life. The premise of a group of people who are immortal has some potential to be interesting, and what do they do with it? Not a single solitary interesting thing. The whole movie is just everyone monologuing about their greater purpose and how they believe in the will of the Celestial, but then, oh no, the planet's gonna explode, so now they have to stop it, and it goes against their creator, and yeah, it's all stuff we've seen before in plenty of other places. And I swear, you have to try to make me care this little, because there is barely anything of substance in here. There's like 10 main characters in this movie, and none of them have any personality whatsoever. Almost every line could have been said by someone else, and it would play out virtually the same. Maybe 1 or 2 have some slight deviations, like the one that ends up betraying all of them, but that role could have been filled by any of them, and it wouldn't make a difference. The only ones that I found mildly interesting were the one that actually starts a family, which has a decent scene where he's talking to his son, but that's the only thing that really happens with him, and one becomes a Bollywood movie actor, and his explanation for why he doesn't age is that he's just playing the previous actor's son in a long line. That's actually kind of funny. Everyone else, though, I don't think I could tell you a single thing about them. And what the hell was going on with the direction in this movie? These are some pretty talented actors, and everyone says their lines as awkwardly as possible, which makes even less sense when you find out that Chloe Zhao directed this? What? Was this just for a paycheck, or did the studio interfere or something? Because I genuinely have no idea how this movie ended up like this. I guess they were kind of trying to experiment, but it failed miserably because whatever they were going for resulted in something that is nearly impossible to give even the slightest of craps about.
But you want to know what the worst thing about this movie is? It isn't the bland story or wooden acting or boring characters. No. The absolute worst thing about this movie is this.
Who in their right mind decided that the most bland and uninteresting movie in the MCU should be 2.5 hours long? For those of you unaware, that makes this the 3rd longest MCU movie ever made. No, I am not joking. This absolute slog of a movie is longer than Avengers Infinity War. Why? What is it about this movie that was so crucial and important that you felt the need to make it that freaking long? I gotta say, this movie has a very fitting title because it felt like an eternity. Seriously, this movie was so overly long and ungodly boring that it was easily the toughest movie watching experience I've had to do for one of these ranking videos so far. It was that bad. I guess the character's powers had a few mildly creative action scenes, and sometimes it got a light chuckle, even if unintentional. Like, seriously, the weird delivery of some lines can make them unintentionally funny for me a couple of times. but the vast majority of this movie was a chore to get through. Eternals was the first MCU movie to actually get a rotten score on Rotten Tomatoes, which I find a little ridiculous because there were bad ones before this, but I'm glad I'm not the only one who realized how awful this movie is. It was the only one released in 2021 that I didn't see in theaters, and there is no way in hell I would have watched it if it wasn't for this stupid ranking.
But thankfully, that's the only 2 out of 10 movie as a part of this ranking, so at least the 3s will be a slight improvement.
Say, fellas, did somebody mention the door to darkness?
This is often regarded as the MCU's first proper stinker, and it was the lowest rated Marvel movie for the longest time, though it was still technically positive, which makes no sense, because this movie stinks. Marvel usually regards itself as being really fun and joyful, so it's weird to see a movie from them just feel so lifeless. I swear, there is no personality or charm coming from this movie at all, except for him. Everything feels extremely generic and forgettable, from the story, to the characters, to the writing, to even the action. None of it sticks out in any way. Thor does technically have an arc, but it's not very memorable and nowhere near as strong as his arc in the other movies. Jane is completely whatever, which is a problem because her fate is one of the main emotional motivators of the movie, so that doesn't work. And her friends are somehow 10 times worse because Darcy is bafflingly annoying in this movie. Like, she was tolerable in the first one, but here she is just so snotty and obnoxious and just, oh my god, I couldn't stand her in this movie. Even the visuals are uninteresting. We don't spend that much time in Asgard, and everywhere else might as well be a black void because it's so dark and bland and uninteresting. Seriously, why is this movie seemingly allergic to having a personality?
But nothing compares to easily the worst part of this movie, the villain.
So the main thread of this movie is literally a group of dark elves who want to use the ether to cover the universe in darkness. If you've seen anything ever, that probably sounds like the most generic thing in the world. Then congrats, because you've now learned the most interesting thing about them. Seriously, there is nothing unique or creative about this guy at all. His design, his voice, his plan, his motivation, his powers, they are all extremely forgettable. Don't believe me? What's his name? I'm fairly confident you didn't answer, and even if you did, I'm just gonna assume you're wrong because I can't correct you, simply because I don't know the answer. Yeah, that's how forgettable this guy is. I don't even remember his name, and I don't care enough to look it up. He leaves that little of an impact. Hell, the only remotely interesting thing this movie has is that it introduces the Reality Stone, but that's not exactly something groundbreaking. Though there is one saving grace to this movie, and that is Loki. He's easily the best part of the movie, and it's not even remotely close. He spends the majority of the movie locked up, but whenever he does show up, he is absolutely hilarious, especially when they let him out because he's just constantly pissing off Thor, and it's delightful. This honestly could have been the whole movie, and I might have given it a pass. Thor: The Dark World is one of the most joyless superhero movies I have ever seen. It's so dull and boring and forgettable that it leaves next to no impact as soon as it's over. Don't watch this movie because I hadn't seen it before, and I wasn't really missing anything. Except for you, Loki. I love you.
My fellow Americans, I think we all know where this is going, so let's just skip to the end.
This movie feels completely half-baked in just about every single way. The story, the characters, the writing, the action, barely anything has any amount of effort put into it. Aside from maybe some of the performances. Anthony Mackie does a decent enough job, and Harrison Ford being here is pretty cool, but while their characters both have positive elements, they still have some big issues. Sam is a likable enough protagonist, but that mainly comes from how well he was established in the previous movies. Here, all he really does is look for stuff and ask questions. He doesn't really feel like a central character, he just feels like he's going through the motions. And Ross has some decent ideas with how morally gray he can be, but he still feels pretty sidelined.
Oh, and you know all that Red Hulk stuff that was in all of the trailers and a bunch of the posters? Yeah, that's not until the climax. And it somehow looks worse than the original Hulk movie.
This whole thing honestly feels less like a Captain America movie and more like a sequel to the first Hulk movie, which, spoilers for this list, isn't very good, so I wasn't really looking forward to seeing how that story continue, especially since Hulk isn't actually in the movie, so what's the point? The story itself is way too convoluted to actually get invested in, the action is extremely standard, and the comedy is not funny. Speaking of which, I don't like Joaquin, since all he does is make unfunny jokes or spout random science babble. I really hope he's better in the TV show he came from. The villain's backstory isn't awful, but his plan makes no sense, and he's barely in the movie, so he doesn't really feel like that much of a threat. Hell, his main goal is just to turn Ross into Red Hulk and make him go on a rampage, so the main villain isn't even the focal point of the climax. That's dumb. I'll admit there are a few scenes in here that I like. The part with the boat is cool, and when Sam and Bucky talk in the hospital, it's nice because we actually get an insight into their characters, but that's really about it, because the main bulk of this movie is just so bland and uninteresting that I was so drained by the end of it. It doesn't have as many egregious flaws as the bottom two movies on this list, but it left me feeling so empty that I had to put it this low. I think my thoughts on this movie can best be summed up by what Harrison Ford says when he's asked a random Star Wars question. I really don't care.
And thankfully, those are the only 3 out of 10 movies on this list, so at least the 4s will probably give me something a bit more to talk about. Right?
Back in the 90s.
Between Infinity War and Endgame, the MCU unfortunately released what would end up being one of its most divisive films. I had heard both positive and negative things about it since its release, mainly on the negative, but I was still holding out hope that I would enjoy myself. But no, I'm sorry. Captain Marvel is not a good movie.
I really hope I didn't come across as one of those anti-woke idiots for saying that, but I'm sorry, I just didn't find this movie very interesting.
The story was insanely generic and forgettable. It's just a basic conflict involving aliens, and there's some kind of a twist thrown in later with the Skrulls not actually being the bad guys. Spoiler, I guess, but it doesn't really work because we don't really see much of them for it to be super interesting, and the team Carol Danvers is working for being the real villains also doesn't work because we literally see them talking with Ronan from Guardians of the Galaxy earlier in the movie, so that just gives it away right there. Oh yeah, and the fact that they have the same freaking species name as him. Carol herself isn't a super compelling character in this. She's not bad, but she has next to no personality. Aside from an occasional quip, she spends most of the movie either brooding or asking questions, which, yeah, I know she's trying to learn more about her past, but that doesn't mean she needs to feel like a plank of wood half the time. They talk about how she needs to keep her emotions in check, but that doesn't really go anywhere. The whole amnesia thing doesn't really add that much, since it feels like a forced way to withhold information from the audience until they need to reveal it later. And I don't know what was going on with Brie Larson's performance.
Like, I have nothing against her. I think she's a totally fine actress, and she's been in plenty of stuff that I've enjoyed before, but here, she just ranges from passable enough to honestly pretty awkward.
I think the best way to describe it is that when she tries to have some personality, like making a quip or seeming like she's having fun, she's okay. But when she's trying to play up the drama, it comes across as really phony and awkward. Honestly, I think she gives a much better performance later on in the MCU, so this mainly boils down to the directing. But she's not the only one. Some of the other actors can be awkward as hell. The action in this movie isn't bad, but most of it isn't super interesting, and it doesn't even get that many laughs. There's a handful of chuckles, but even then, there's very few. Now, there are some things that I like about this movie, mainly Nick Fury. Aside from the first Avengers and kind of the Winter Soldier, this is the only one where he's a major character. And even then, he's way more prominent in this than in those other films. They do a really solid job of fleshing out his backstory and how he came to form the Avengers in the first place. And while I don't find her super interesting on her own, his dynamic with Carol is actually pretty solid. They have some decent banter together, and it leads to some enjoyable moments. Plus, the de-aging effect on Samuel L. Jackson is genuinely solid. I'm kind of mixed on the cat alien being the reason he wears an eye patch, since it may seem lame, but it is honestly kind of funny. And the climax does have some pretty fun moments, since this is when the movie is allowed to actually be fun and creative. But that's all this movie really has, moments. It's not awful, but I didn't really have a good time watching it. For the MCU's first female-led movie, this really should have been a lot more unique. Genuinely, the best part of the movie is Stan Lee, both in the opening credits, which is really sweet, and I like how his proper cameo as I'm holding up the script for Mallrats. That's cute.
Fear my giant floating head!
This is one of the most in one ear and out the other movies I have ever seen in my life. I'm not joking, I had as little emotion as possible when watching this movie. I wasn't enjoying myself, but I wasn't really begging for it to be over either. It seriously left no impact on me.
Now, you could argue that's worse than something that's more memorably bad, but me having no emotion means I didn't feel bored while watching this movie, so it was certainly much easier to get through than the lower stuff on this list.
I do think there are maybe one or two things that work here. Actually exploring this aspect of the quantum realm is kind of cool. It's obviously CG, sure, but the visuals are creative, and I do want to learn more about it. Problem is, we barely learn anything about it, so yeah, not great. Pretty much everything about this movie isn't egregiously awful, but it's not really enjoyable either. The whole thing just feels like it's on autopilot. The story is just everyone gets stuck in this other world that lies beyond their universe, and they have to get out. It's extremely basic, which would be fine if the characters were interesting, but while they were good in the previous movies, here, everyone just feels like they're going through the motions. Nothing has any sort of impact on them, and they have next to no development whatsoever. Scott and Cassie don't feel any closer than they did in the previous movies. We kind of see Hope form more of a connection with her mother, but it doesn't really leave that much of an impact, and Hank is honestly just there for the most part. The main purpose of this movie was to set up Kang as the next big threat to the MCU, which, oops. But while they do a decent job of making him look powerful, they don't do a great job of making him interesting. There's clearly an attempt with him being a version that was banished from beyond time, but again, they don't really go anywhere with it since he's just a power-hungry maniac and not much else. His entire character is just, if you think one of him is strong, wait until you have to deal with millions of him, which again, oops. It doesn't help that the action doesn't go much further beyond what we saw in the previous Ant-Man movies, and the comedy isn't terrible, but it's not very good either. There's only one scene in this movie that I'd say I genuinely like, and that's when Scott is trying to get the energy core along with a bunch of different versions of himself. It's funny, creative, has some good energy, and honestly fairly solid character moments. If the rest of the movie was more like this, I probably would have liked it.
But on the flip side, there's only one thing that I absolutely hate about this movie, and you know exactly what it is. Freaking MODOK.
Sweet mother of Christ, literally everything about this character is awful, except for maybe the idea. The concept of bringing back the villain from the first Ant-Man movie isn't awful, but they don't do anything to make him more interesting, which he already wasn't, and they even tried to give him a forced redemption arc, which goes about as well as you think you would. But the biggest issue should be something I don't even need to say if you're looking at the screen right now. Good God, that has got to be the worst effect in the entirety of the MCU. I already knew what he looked like before watching this movie, and the full weight doesn't truly hit you true until you actually watch it in context. It is hideous. It just looks hideous. Some things just don't translate to live action well, and Egg Boy Mr. Electric here is clearly one of them. Yeah, that's 2 rankings where I made an Egg Boy comparison. What are you gonna do about it? But outside of that abomination, Quantumania was cinematic white noise. This is currently tied for the lowest rated MCU movie on Rotten Tomatoes, as well as the only one to be nominated for any Razzies, but I wouldn't say it's the absolute worst. Not good, but it isn't terrible either. Oh, right, I just remember Bill Murray is in this movie, and he is clearly just here for the paycheck.
The old switcheroo.
This has got to be one of the least discussed Marvel movies ever, probably because it's the only one on this list that straight up didn't make its budget back. Now, despite hearing mostly bad things, I wasn't dreading it as much as some of the other movies on here for one simple reason. It is by far the shortest movie in the MCU, clocking in at only an hour and 45 minutes. So even if I didn't like it, it wouldn't waste my time as much as other movies. Eternals.
Though after watching it, I realized there was no way this movie was actually meant to be this short. It feels like there were so many scenes that were either trimmed down or just flat out cut entirely because so many aspects of this movie are rushed, underdeveloped, or both.
This movie is constantly moving, not because it has more stuff to say, but because almost nothing is given proper time to breathe. The story is extremely bland, and while they try to get some twists, it doesn't leave an impact because of how trimmed down it feels. The villain, on top of being hilariously stupid and generic, has barely any screen time across the entire film, and the emotional moments have next to no payoff whatsoever, but we'll get more into that later. Right now, let's actually talk about some of the positives, because there are a few. For starters, the main characters are decent. Carol feels like she has an actual personality now, so she's still nothing amazing, but she is easier to connect with. I didn't watch WandaVision, so I don't know Monica's entire story, but she's okay enough. And Kamala is easily the best part of the movie. I didn't see Ms. Marvel either, but I kind of want to now because of this. She plays the role of a starstruck fangirl really well, since everything about her feels genuine. She never comes across as annoying or whiny. She's honestly kind of adorable, and knows how to pull her weight too, which I really like. There's some interesting ideas, like them switching places when they use their powers at the same time, but this is only really used to full effect once, and it's at the beginning when they first start doing it. Them changing locations and getting involved in 3 different action scenes is honestly pretty cool, but after that, it's either extremely basic or so sloppily edited that you can barely see what's happening. Then there's stuff like the singing planet, which could have been annoying, but does at least have some ingenuity to it. And the scene where the cat aliens eat everybody as memories from cats plays in the background is so bafflingly ridiculous that it made me laugh really hard. Like, this is probably my favorite scene in the movie, and I can't tell if that's a good thing or not. Honestly, I was going back and forth on whether or not I should give this movie a 4 or a 5 out of 10, but I ultimately settled on a 4 because of the climax. I'm not kidding, I don't think this even lasts 15 minutes. The villain is defeated so quickly that it isn't even funny, and there's supposed to be this big dramatic scene of Monica sacrificing herself that doesn't work in the slightest. Also, she's fine, by the way, so I can't say The Marvels is a good movie, or even an okay one, but it's also completely inoffensive.
Well, now we're done with the 4 out of 10 movies, so let's get to the 5s, which I consider just okay.
The Incredible Hulk is the only MCU movie that I genuinely didn't know about when it was released. I'm not kidding, I had no idea it existed until years later when I looked up a list of MCU movies on Wikipedia and said, wait, there is a Hulk movie? Why did I not know about this?
Well, 1, I was only 5 years old when this movie came out, though I also knew about Iron Man. 2, it only came out like a month after Iron Man. And 3, it's not really worth talking about.
I wouldn't say this is a bad film, but I wouldn't say it works either. The main issue is that the majority of it feels way too rushed. Almost every scene is constantly moving a mile a minute, and it's hard to get invested in a lot of the stuff. We don't really see that much of the characters, which is a shame, because I do like Bruce. I want to know more about him, but the movie doesn't really let me because it's constantly jumping to the next scene. I really like the idea of how he feels afraid of the Hulk and wants to try and contain it, but I also would have loved it if we actually got to see more of his struggle. Go more in depth about his fear of it and what it's like when he transforms. We get about one scene where he kinda talks about it, but aside from that, nothing, which feels like a huge missed opportunity. I guess they're going for a show, don't tell approach, but they don't really do a great job of showing it either. We get a handful of moments, but most of it takes a backseat for the overall story, which is fine, it works, but it's also pretty generic. The government wants to track him down and turn him into a weapon, so he spends the whole movie on the run. Haven't seen that in anything else before. Edward Norton's performance is fine, he works well enough, but I'm not exactly upset that they switched him out for Mark Ruffalo either. But hey, at least he's much better than his love interest. Betty is already an extremely forgettable character, but her actress has some of the most whispery, wooden dialogue I've seen in a while. Her performance is bad, honestly one of the worst to come from a Marvel movie. The villains are pretty boring, since one is just a generic evil military leader, and the other is a guy who has his mind broken by being experimented on in a similar way to Bruce, which could be an interesting idea, but again, we don't really go in depth with it. Hell, he's barely in the movie to begin with, so he leaves next to no impact at all, and the CGI on the Hulk is pretty rough. Thank God they improved it for the later movies.
Again, I wouldn't call this a bad movie, because there is some stuff that I like in it.
Some of the ideas are solid, which leads lead to a few interesting moments. The action can be kind of fun in a mindless, cartoony way, and there's honestly some really cool shots in this movie, like the drop of blood falling on the conveyor or the shower head turning into a gun barrel. That stuff is sick. I knew next to nothing about the Incredible Hulk going in, aside from Tony Stark showing up at the end, since like I said before, nobody talks about this movie, and I completely get why now because it's a movie I'm very quickly gonna move on from. It was watchable, but you could just as easily skip it.
I am a surgeon!
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I really did not get into Doctor Strange. I wanted to, since I think it has some really strong elements, and it seemed like a cool idea, but to me, this really felt like they were trying to replicate what they did with the previous MCU movies, mainly Iron Man, without really adding anything super unique to it. Stephen Strange is the biggest culprit of that. I have no idea what he's like in the comics, but here he's pretty much another Tony Stark. A snarky genius who's full of himself and gets under the skin of other people, but he's good at what he does, so they all have to put up with him, especially a woman who works close with him and is very clearly set up to be a love interest. While Tony is funny and charming, Steven is honestly kind of an annoying twat. I mean, much like Tony, he has some tragic event that alters his life and sends him onto the path of becoming a superhero, but rather than being kidnapped by terrorists and being forced to confront the harm he's been unintentionally causing, he's just in a random car accident that damages his hands, meaning he can't be a surgeon anymore. Like, there is no build-up for this, and it doesn't really tie into his character very well, so it leaves next to no impact and leaves me not very sympathetic when he starts snapping at everyone around him. Thankfully, things get a bit more interesting when he goes to the Sanctum and meets the Ancient One, but he still isn't very likable. He's much better in the later movies, but here I just didn't really enjoy watching him. Hell, his freaking cloak was a more enjoyable character than him.
And I wish that was the only issue I had with this movie, but sadly, most of its other aspects are not much better.
Like a lot of the lower movies on this list, the story was extremely generic and predictable. The only thing of note was that this movie introduces the Time Stone. The side characters weren't awful, but they're not very memorable either, except for the Cloak of Levitation, of course. The villain is, once again, extremely boring, since it's either some random off-screen force or the traditional trope of heroes, but evil, and we don't really learn that much about them. Even the comedy isn't that great. There are some funny moments like Strange using his portals to steal books from the library, or him putting the villain in a time loop where he keeps killing him, but outside of that, there aren't that many big laughs. But the one thing that absolutely carries this movie is the visuals. This honestly might have the best effects in the entire MCU. I was genuinely in awe at some of this stuff. The different ways the world distorts and the camera spins around and all of the different things that phase in and out of reality, it is mind-blowing how creative it is, and it doesn't just look good, it looks great. How the hell did this movie not win the Oscar for Best Visual Effects? This stuff is incredible, and it alone made the movie worth watching at least once. But that's the keyword here, once. I have no desire to ever return to this movie again, since while it's not bad, it's nothing spectacular either.
How about another joke, Murray?
No, I think we've had enough of your jokes.
Thor: Love and Thunder is insanely frustrating, because I genuinely think every aspect of this movie works except for one. But that one element is done so poorly that it really brings down the whole thing to the point where I can't say it's good. I think the story is genuinely interesting. Watching Thor try and pick himself up after the low points of Ragnarok and the Avengers movies is fun to watch, and he remains a very likable character. Korg and Valkyrie are decent side characters, and Jane is honestly better here than she was in the first two movies. She's still not amazing, but she at least does stuff, and the way she uses the shattering hammer is pretty cool. The action scenes are genuinely pretty fun, and the visuals are really creative. And the God Butcher is a fantastic villain. He's such a threatening concept, and Christian Bale plays him absolutely perfectly because he is freaky. But his motivation is honestly understandable thanks to a genuinely fantastic opening. I mean it when I say I could very easily see myself liking this movie.
Unfortunately, it is completely killed by what is easily the worst comedy in any Marvel movie ever.
Normally when a Marvel joke doesn't work, it's just kind of whatever, at least for me anyway, but there are so many jokes in this movie that aren't just not funny, they are painfully unfunny, to the point where I was genuinely groaning at most of them, and this movie just does not let up. It can't keep a consistent tone to save its life. You'll go from Jean having a breakdown about how she's literally dying of cancer, and then 2 minutes later a gag about Valkyrie bringing a portable speaker along for the adventure. That's not funny. And genuinely, who approved of the screaming goats pulling their chariot? Because that person needed to be fired. Why did so many movies latch onto the stupid overused joke that was based on an internet video that wasn't even a real scream or a real goat? This movie uses it so many times and it just gets worse with each one. It was never funny to begin with. Genuinely, off the top of my head, I could only think of 2 jokes that kind of worked for me. Some of the reactions to Thor getting his clothes flicked off got a few chuckles, especially when some of them were disappointed when they put them back on. I mean, I can't say I blame them, it's Chris Hemsworth for crying out loud. And while Thor's axe being jealous of his hammer is stupid and doesn't make sense since it didn't have a problem in Endgame, the part where it slowly slides into frame as if it's looking at him with disgust did get a genuine laugh out of me. Everything else, though, was extremely obnoxious. I've never really had a huge problem with the quippy Marvel humor like a lot of other people do, but this is the only one where it got to me because it just isn't funny. Again, if this movie just shut up and wasn't desperately trying to make you laugh all the time, I would have thought it was good. Not amazing, but worth watching at least once. But instead, we get a movie that has some solid elements, but I am never going to watch again.
But now we can finally get to the movies that I actually think are good, beginning with the 6 out of 10s.
A lot of people seem to not like Iron Man 2, but personally, I had a good time with it. Though I can kind of see why it gets flack. It's a lot more goofy and lighthearted than the first Iron Man movie was. I think this was the first Marvel movie to incorporate the quippy humor into it a lot more, which was already a bit of a jump from the first movie, and nowadays it's something people are sick to death of.
But I am willing to give it a pass because, well, I think it's funny. Yeah, as long as your movie is funny, I am perfectly okay with it being more lighthearted. And this movie does have some genuinely really great comedy moments.
Like when Tony and Rhodey are fighting in the suits or the bit with the strawberry salesman, that stuff is hilarious. So I can see people not being fond of this, but it didn't really bother me. What did bother me though is that there's a lot of plot points in this movie and most of them don't mesh very well. I mean, first you've got the fact that Tony Stark revealed his secret identity, which is an interesting idea since you didn't see that very often in superhero movies at the time. But all this really amounts to is him speaking with the government on whether or not he should hand over his suit, something that's only touched upon briefly. We also find out that Tony is actually being poisoned by the core that's also keeping him alive, but this isn't really taken seriously. He mainly uses it as an excuse to go wild with what he thinks are his final weeks of life, which can be funny, but also feels a little out of place. He also puts Pepper Potts in charge of Stark Industries, which didn't really go anywhere. Rhodey officially becomes War Machine, and he looks a bit different, which is neat, but again, feels a little sidelined. Black Widow was formally introduced, but she doesn't really do that much until the climax, and the most egregiously of all, the villains. Yeah, I'm gonna be criticizing the villains a lot in this ranking, aren't I? Whiplash might be the most disappointing villain in the MCU, since he has a great setup. The backstory with Tony's father deporting his is really interesting. Him being able to build similar technology to Tony is a cool idea. Mickey Rourke gives a really fun yet threatening performance, and the scene where he uses his whips to attack the race car track is really cool. But the problem is, after that, they barely do anything with him. He gets arrested, but then gets bailed out so he can work for this other billionaire, and this guy just sucks. He's basically the same thing as the villain from the first Iron Man movie, who already wasn't very good, only he's 10 times more annoying. I said this movie was funny, but that does not apply to this guy. I hated him and found him extremely unpleasant to watch.
So yeah, there is a lot of stuff to keep track of in this movie, but thankfully I think it mostly works.
Tony is still a really good core of the movie since he is a great character, and Robert Downey Jr. only makes him better. There are some emotional moments, like the scene where he finds the tape of his dad, and the action is still pretty cool and fun. The one thing I'd say this movie does better than the first one is the climax. Having Tony fight off all these drones while also dealing with Rhodey, whose suit has gone out of control, is pretty fun and leads to some creative stuff. Though when Whiplash joins, it feels kinda weak. Not only is it, again, a rehash of the first movie, which wasn't that great, but he goes down way too easily. So yeah, this movie is pretty flawed and not as good as the first one, but overall, I had a good time with Iron Man 2 despite all of that. There was enough good stuff here to make the movie worth watching. It's commonly regarded as one of the weaker MCU movies, but I don't think that's entirely fair. Oh, wait, never mind. Elon Musk is in this movie. Ew.
This is blasphemy. This is madness.
I feel like some people are gonna get mad at me that I like this more than the first one, but before you do, let me just say, this still isn't a great movie, but it did give me more of what I was looking for in a Doctor Strange film. Steven is much less of an asshole in this movie, and he does form a decent connection with America. The visuals aren't quite as mind-blowing, but they still look really cool, and this is one of the few Marvel movies that really feels like a director was given freedom to do what they wanted. Not all of the time, but there are plenty of moments where it really feels like a Sam Raimi movie. The number one example being Zombie Strange at the end, and that feels like something straight out of Evil Dead, and some of these death scenes are absolutely brutal. A monster literally gets its eye stabbed out, and that's in the opening fight scene.
The biggest issue with this movie is that the multiverse concept feels extremely underutilized.
I mean, the movie is literally called Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, so you'd think this whole movie is them traveling to all sorts of different crazy universes, right? Well, no, because you want to know how many of them they actually go to? 4. I'm not joking. And even then, it's more like 2, since the first one is just in the opening, the second one is the main one where Strange is from, the third one is where we spend half of the movie, and the fourth one is for the third act, which has been mostly destroyed. So really, it's more like 1.5. And no, this little montage where they fly through a bunch of different dimensions doesn't count because each one only lasts like a second. The Phineas and Ferb movie explored more alternate dimensions than this, so that aspect of the movie really needed to be stronger. It's kinda sad that this was the beginning of people getting sick of multiverse movies because it was only the second film to really dive into it. Though part of that is because this came out less than 2 months after Everything Everywhere All at Once, and that was a movie that explored the multiverse concept in a super unique and creative way, while also using it to tell an engaging and emotional story. This honestly uses is it for a few decent ideas and some cameos that honestly feel like they're trolling the audience since all of them are brutally killed with ease, which I actually kinda love. But thankfully, while the movie does have a lot of missed potential, it's at least partially reflected by what it does with Wanda. Now again, I never saw WandaVision, but I did read a plot synopsis so I know what happens, and while it does seem like kind of a big jump for her, I'm willing to look past that because her fully becoming the Scarlet Witch is genuinely one of the most intimidating villains in Marvel history. I'm not joking, she is legitimately threatening in this movie. Seeing a hero actually go full villain is something the MCU never really did before, and she's one of the most powerful heroes, which makes things even more intense.
Now, her motivation is basically the same as Kingpin and Into the Spider-Verse with how she wants to find alternate versions of her family so that she can be with them again. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I think this does it better. Because we actually get to see her connection with her kids.
She sifts into a different version of herself, and her reaction to finally seeing them again is really emotional. But when she tries to take them by force later and she sees just how afraid of her they are, it is easily the best scene in the movie. With Kingpin, we barely saw him interact with his family, so his motivation felt kinda underwhelming, but here, we really do see how much Wanda cares about her kids, and it really adds this sense of tragedy to her character.
I'm by no means saying that this movie is better than Spider-Verse, not by a long shot, but I am saying that I think this one idea was explored much better here.
So Multiverse of Madness may have some missed potential, but I still think it was worth seeing at least once. It had some creativity, cool action, a few laughs, and a fantastic villain that was both threatening and sympathetic. This movie is pretty divisive, but I personally think it works fine enough. Plus it has Bruce Campbell in it, and who doesn't love him?
Red Skull. It puts wings on your head.
I think Captain America might have the biggest gap between how often its entries are discussed, because Winter Soldier and Civil War are some of the most popular superhero movies ever, but no one really seems to care about the first one, or Brave New World, but that's a different Captain America. And I assume the reason for that is because this movie is really basic. That's not to say it's bad, but it's pretty standard when it comes to superhero origin stories. Now there are a few things that set it apart, like the fact that it takes place during World War II, and Captain America being used as a type of war propaganda is a really clever idea. But the rest of the movie isn't anything groundbreaking. Chris Evans is amazing as Steve Rogers, though I think it took him a little bit of time to really flesh out the character, and you can see it here since as the movie goes on, he really does grow to become more of a strong leader, but it's nowhere near as strong as in the later movies.
Though he does have some really good moments here, particularly at the end.
The scene where he sacrifices himself is pretty effective. His discussion with Peggy is really emotional, and the call abruptly cutting off is chilling. Plus when he wakes up and realizes how much time has passed, he goes through so many different emotions like shock, fear, sadness, and confusion, all of which are sold really well. The supporting characters like Peggy and Bucky are good. They have a good variety of personality and a great dynamic with Steve. I really like how Steve and Peggy's relationship grows over the course of the film, though Bucky falling off the train doesn't really hit when you know he's alive, but whatever. It's also kind of cool how we actually get to see Howard Stark in this movie since we only heard about him in the Iron Man films. There aren't a huge amount of jokes in this movie, so the comedy's nothing spectacular, and the action is good, but not great. I'd say the climax on the ship is the most interesting part, though even then it's nothing all too special. The thing about the movie I'm most split on is Red Skull, because his backstory is really good, and I love his design, especially since they wait to fully reveal what he truly looks like, which makes for a really cool scene. But man, his dialogue is some of the most generic villain stuff I've ever heard in my life. I swear 90% of the stuff he says could be said by just about any other villain because he is extremely forgettable, which is a bit of a problem since he's one of the most well-known Marvel villains ever, and he has so many monologues in this movie that it honestly gets kind of ridiculous. It's also worth noting that this movie has the first known instance of an Infinity Stone in the saga, that being the Space Stone, which is contained in the Tesseract, the main MacGuffin of the movie. And this thing is pretty cool since its power allows Red Skull to make some interesting weapons, though part of me wishes that Cap had it in the ship with him when he got frozen, since it would have made them both returning a bit more interesting. Instead, it falls in the ocean, and they find it pretty quickly, but then they just keep it locked away for 70 years.
I don't know, I feel like that's a bit too long of a time gap for something this powerful to just be sitting in a box this whole time. I mean, I know it comes back in Captain Marvel and Endgame later, but still, that might just be a me thing.
The first Avenger is obviously not as strong as the later Captain America movies with Steve Rogers, but it does the job fine enough. It was worth watching at least once, though it's nothing I'm jumping at to watch again. It's technically the first film in the MCU timeline, and as far as that stuff goes, it certainly could have gone a lot worse. Hey, shut up, I actually like that movie.
Baby, when you're small.
Ant-Man is a pretty simple movie, but it's also pretty fun. It follows a lot of similar tropes as most Marvel movies, but there's two main things that help it set apart. One is that it's more of a heist movie than a superhero movie, which means it does follow a lot of different tropes, but that still makes it a bit more unique in this lineup. And the other is the concept of Ant-Man being able to shrink down. The visuals of everything around him being massive are really impressive, and some of the CG is a little obvious, but it still looks cool seeing a lot of this stuff. When he's flying around on the wingman or when he gets stuck in the drain, these are both really creative and really funny. Plus, Scott learning to control the ants to help him is cool and fun. The movie overall has good good writing. It's a lot more lighthearted than other Marvel movies, even the ones that lean a lot more comedically, like Iron Man 2 or Guardians of the Galaxy. Those still have some serious moments, but this one is mainly just supposed to be fun, and it succeeds at that.
And the main reason for that, aside from the creativity, is the characters.
Scott is an archetype of a former crook trying to get his life on track, but you can still sympathize with him pretty easily. Paul Rudd is usually good at making characters like this enjoyable, and this is no exception. His main anchor is his daughter, which is another common trope, and one that could easily be annoying, but she's honestly really funny. So you do want to see him reconnect with her, and you care when she's put in danger towards the end. Hope and Hank are basic, but they work well enough, and the backstory with Hope's mother going missing in action is also simple, but it adds a bit more weight to their situation. Scott pals are a bit hit or miss, but I think they have enough jokes to make them work. The villain is pretty boring, and it's also kind of confusing since there's basically two main villains, and I couldn't really tell which one was supposed to be the actual threat.
Though while this movie is enjoyable, I don't think it quite reaches its full potential until the last third, and especially the climax.
Like a lot of other heist movies, the first half is mainly build-up, and the second half is them carrying it out, which works fine, but it's something you haven't seen before besides the shrinking stuff, which again is mainly just training. But here we really get to see it in action, and it leads to some really cool stuff. But then the real climax with the Yellow Jacket takes place inside his daughter's room, and this is where the shrinking stuff is used to its full potential. This is such an out-there place for a climax that it really helps it stand out, and it leads to easily the funniest moments in the film. That freaking Thomas train absolutely killed me. That was so funny. But it turns out there's a reason this movie feels so lopsided. Apparently, the original director left the project due to studio interference and was replaced with Peyton Reed. And while Reed does a fine enough job, do you want to know who the original director was? Edgar freaking Wright. And like, come on, I literally just made a whole ranking talking about how awesome that guy's stuff was. So I really wish we got to see what his original vision was, because the better parts of this movie really feel like something he would do. It might not be one of the best things out there, but it still turned in a fairly solid movie that I'm glad I got to watch, and I wouldn't mind watching again. I know the general reception for all three of these movies is pretty mixed, but I think this was a good time. I mean, it's certainly not the low point of the trilogy, I'll give it that.
Bite my shiny metal ass.
Age of Ultron is one of those movies that I really want to like more than I actually do. Before I rewatched it, I was really hoping it would be better than I remembered, but sadly, it isn't. It is good, I still enjoyed watching it, but it's pretty underwhelming compared to the other Avengers movies. The main problem is that there's just way too much going on. The first Avengers kept the plot relatively simple, so you can mainly focus more on the characters, but this movie is trying to be both the next big installment in the MCU, while also being set up for future movies, so it doesn't really mesh very well. You've got the follow-up on Hydra having Loki's scepter, as well as Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, and while that stuff is important later, Hydra completely disappears once Ultron takes over. Speaking of which, you've got Iron Man creating Ultron, who ends up turning evil because he's an AI system in a movie, that just happens. We learn that Hawkeye has a family, we find out the scepter contains the Mind Stone, which is then used to create Vision, which is a fusion of the stone, artificial human tissue, and Tony's other computer system, Jarvis. The whole backstory with the twins, learning more about Black Widow, fishing out Cap and Iron Man's disagreements, which will lead into Civil War, going in depth with Hulk and how he sees himself, and oh my god, this movie is all over the place. There are so many plot points that it has to keep juggling that it just feels insanely lopsided and unfocused at times. I mean, Thor just leaves for 20 minutes halfway through the movie so we can learn about the Infinity Stones to help make Vision. We get cameos in the party from War Machine, who doesn't come back until the climax, and Falcon, who doesn't come back at all. This movie really can't decide if it wants to be a follow-up to the first Avengers or building blocks for Civil War and Infinity War, so it just ends up feeling like filler.
Which is a shame, because I think this movie does have some great elements to it.
I'll go more into this when we get to the first Avengers movie, but the characters are all really solid. Honestly, the best part of the movie is the party in the first act, where we just see them hanging out together. It really showcases their differing personalities, and they all have great chemistry with each other. This scene honestly does a much better job of fleshing out stuff from the last Avengers movie, while also setting up stuff for later much better than the rest of the movie does. Particularly the scene where they all try to lift Thor's hammer and how Cap is the only one that manages to move it. That's really clever. Ultron is sadly a super mixed bag of a villain. He's the only one from an Avengers movie to have no real build-up, so that already makes him underwhelming. His design is cool, and his voice can be threatening, plus his introduction with him controlling all the discarded robot suits is honestly pretty creepy. And I like the idea of him being able to control multiple bodies at once, making him much harder to destroy. But he turns evil almost immediately, so there's no real sense of dread to him, and the idea of an AI deciding that humanity is evil and must be destroyed is one of the most overused villain tropes ever. And this movie adds nothing new to it. Ultron just ends up being extremely generic and forgettable. The writing and jokes are about on par with the first Avengers movie. There are some funny scenes, and they don't distract too much from the tone, unlike other Joss Whedon superhero projects. And the action is pretty cool. In the opening fight with Hydra Base infiltrating the facility, Iron Man using the Hulkbuster to bring Hulk down, there's some really awesome stuff in here. Though the climax is nothing spectacular, it's a cool idea of trying to prevent an entire city from falling into the earth, since it makes for an interesting visual, but most of the action is stuff we already saw in the last movie, and this one doesn't do anything different barring a few new characters. Speaking of which, Wanda and Pietro could have used a lot more fleshing out, and Vision doesn't come in until the last third, so he's nothing spectacular either. There's also two big issues I have with the climax. One is I feel like Iron Man should have used the Hulkbuster armor again, since he literally has it, and that would have been very helpful to help this climax stand out more from the Battle of New York. And Quicksilver's death is extremely forced. I know it was because of licensing issues with Fox owning the rights sacrifice to the X-Men, but if they had to kill him off, they could have at least done it in a better way. This dude literally has super speed, and you're telling me he couldn't have run faster than a gun to get these two out of the way? Yeah, sorry, I'm not buying that.
I know I've mostly been complaining, but don't get me wrong, I do like this movie. It just has a bunch of little things that keep poking away at me over and over again to the point where I can't enjoy it as much as I really want to.
A lot of people were disappointed in this movie when it came out, not because it was bad, but because of how awesome the first Avengers movie was. Age of Ultron really felt like a step backwards. It's still a decent movie, but it's not really worth returning to after you've seen it unless you're going through all of these movies. It's got a great cast, good jokes, cool action sequences, and some really solid moments. It just feels like it was trying a little too much in some areas. Though it does have the funniest Stan Lee cameo in the MCU, so there is that.
But now that that's settled, we can finally get into some pretty solid 7 out of 10 films.
Look at me. I'm a god.
Thor is without a doubt the most lopsided franchise in the MCU since you got one of the most popular films and two of the most hated, yet the first one is just kinda there. I swear, I never hear anyone talk about this movie. I've seen some people say it's one of the weaker Marvel movies, but nowhere near as many as Dark World or Love and Thunder, so I wasn't really sure what to expect going into this one.
And I thought it was simple, but still pretty solid.
Unlike the other early Marvel movies, this one is more of a fish out of water story, which might be a little disappointing for some people, but I think it works because the main character is so likable. Chris Hemsworth plays Thor a lot more nobly in this movie than in a lot of the later MCU films, which I was kind of surprised to see, but I think it works really well here. I enjoy seeing him discover all this stuff on Earth and how dignified he sees himself, but it never goes too far. He still treats the people around him with respect. He doesn't act like he's above anybody, he just believes it's his duty to protect anyone he can. The whole reason he's banished Earth in the first place was because he was trying to protect Asgard from these ice giants, which is a great way of showing how he's both brave and reckless, so he has a lot of room to grow. He's able to command a lot of authority despite making several reckless decisions, and his banishment does lead to him becoming a more forward-thinking person, which I really like. Loki was pretty much the only villain in the first couple of aces in the MCU that people really liked, and while I will have more to say on him when we get to the Avengers, he works really well here too. His backstory is simple yet effective, and he has a lot of layers to him that make him both interesting and fun. He's struggling to understand his place in the world, yet he's also a spoiled brat that wants what he thinks is owed to him. This could have fallen apart very easily, but the way he's written combined with Tom Hiddleston's performance make him very enjoyable to watch. Asgard is a really cool world, and we don't spend a huge amount of time in it, but the time we do spend fleshes out pretty well while still leaving us wanting more. And I really like how they tie it into actual Norse mythology while still being its own thing.
But sadly, this movie falls a little flat with the side characters.
Jane isn't an awful character, but she's easily one of the most uninteresting love interests in the MCU. Her main thing is just that she's a scientist, and that's pretty much it. She has little to no interesting chemistry with Thor, and you can tell Natalie Portman is doing her best, but she isn't really given that much to work with. And her friends are extremely forgettable too. I mean, Darcy is nowhere near as annoying in this one as she is in the sequel, so I guess that's nice, but I still don't care about them at all. Thor's Asgard friends were honestly way more interesting to me, but they're barely in the movie, which is a little disappointing. But the action is pretty solid, especially the climax in Asgard, and the comedy gets some decent laughs. Thor was honestly a pretty pleasant surprise. It's a very standard movie, but it's anchored very well by its main character and interesting setting. I had a good time with this film, and I think it's worth seeing if you haven't. Certainly more than most of the other Thor movies anyway.
The Black Widow is my favorite movie. I've seen it 100 times. I've memorized all the dialogue.
This is another one that a lot of people find underwhelming, and personally I think some of the backlash it gets is a bit harsh, because I really appreciate it for trying something different. While it has some of the familiar Marvel tropes, it's one of the more grounded entries since none of the characters have powers, except for Alexei, but he's just Russian Captain America, so Captain Russia, which means he doesn't really do anything too flashy, and that's not a complaint since the action in this movie is really cool. It honestly feels more like a spy movie than a superhero movie half the time.
Though the strongest aspect of this movie is definitely its main characters, which is good because that's the most important part.
Natasha was already one of the most popular characters in the MCU, so it's great to finally see her take the starring role. Probably should have happened much earlier, which I'll talk more about later, but either way, I love learning more about her. We got glimpses into her backstory in the earlier movies, but here it's put on full display, and we get a ton of answers to questions I both did and didn't know I wanted, many of which are shown through the sick opening credit sequence. The dynamic she has with her family is really interesting, since despite not actually being related to each other, you do feel the connection they have. There's some genuinely really emotional scenes with them, like when they all snap at each other, or when Melina tells Natasha about her real mother. Yelena has a really interesting connection with Nat, Melina, like I said, has some really emotional moments, and Alexei is absolutely hilarious. He somehow manages to feel like the typical dopey dad trope without being annoying and despite not actually being their real father, and I honestly love that about him. Though while the heroes of this movie are great, the villains leave a lot to be desired. Dreykov's build-up is pretty solid, and I love how much of a personal connection he has with the family, but he really needed to be in the movie more. He doesn't show up until the last third, and Natasha beating him up is satisfying, but it doesn't last very long. Hell, she doesn't even kill him, Yelena does. I get he's supposed to be shrouded in mystery, but I would have liked it a lot more if he was an actual character, and I know a lot of people flack on the whole smell prevents them from hurting him thing, which is ridiculous, but it's still a comic book movie, so I can give phony baloney stuff like that a bit more slack, and I like the idea of Taskmaster, but the twist is really underwhelming. Because I knew there was a twist with her that she was someone important, but I genuinely forgot who she actually was, so yeah, not great. And I know it's not accurate to the original character at all, even if my only knowledge comes from the Spider-Man PS4 game.
But despite all of that, I think this movie is pretty solid. So, why does it get so much flack from people? Well, I think the main reason is due to when it came out.
Not only was it delayed a few times because of COVID, but more importantly, it was the beginning of Phase 4 and the second movie after Endgame, despite taking place shortly after Civil War. And by this point, not only had so many years passed, but Natasha literally died in Avengers Endgame, so this movie is technically the character's send-off. And it doesn't really feel like that. It feels like a beloved character finally getting the spotlight while also getting some backstory. And it does that fine enough, but it doesn't really feel like what people were expecting, especially since, like I said, the character was freaking dead by this point. If this came out when it actually takes place shortly after Civil War or Doctor Strange, I think people would have been more receptive towards it. But sadly, that's not what ended up happening. Regardless, I think Black Widow is a pretty solid movie. Not one of the absolute greats, but certainly worth watching at least once and even coming back to every once in a while.
That's not how you deal with a wasp sting.
Okay, I feel like this is gonna be one of my hotter takes in this video because I've seen more than a few people say this movie is underwhelming or just straight up bad.
And I must ask those people one simple question. Did we watch the same movie? Because I thought this was a really fun time.
This is honestly what I wanted the first one to be, since they utilize the shrinking technology a lot more and in really unique and creative ways. I mean, most of the movie revolves around this portal that they want to use to enter the quantum realm and rescue Hope's mother, which is kept inside a lab. And much of the action revolves around them literally shrinking the entire lab down to the size of a suitcase and fighting over it. That is brilliant. It's such a simple idea, but it's hilarious and results in some really fun and entertaining chase sequences. We get a lot more action scenes in this movie, and all of them are a huge step up from the first one. There's so much fun, and like I said, use the shrinking technology way more. We get some fun spins on it, like Scott's suit not working properly, causing him to grow or shrink at inopportune times. But it's not just the action. Pretty much everything else about this movie is a step up from the first one for me. I thought the story was a lot more interesting, since the stakes feel a lot more personal. I mean, I enjoyed the heist in the first one, but I think this one is a lot more emotional, which makes it more compelling. I thought the character dynamics were much better, since Scott and Hope have much stronger chemistry. The side characters get some great bits, and the subplot with them trying to start a security company is honestly really funny, and I absolutely love the scenes with Scott and Cassie. They were already some of the best parts of the first movie, but this one just makes them even better. Their relationship is so wholesome. Scott trying to have fun with her while under house arrest is funny and sweet, and the scenes where she helps cover for him and encourages him to do the right thing and save Hope and Hank is fantastic. And this movie is honestly way funnier too. The first one had some great gags, but this one, they just keep coming, and it's awesome.
I'd say this movie's biggest improvement over the first one, though, is the villain. I mean, Hornet was just kind of there, but Ghost is genuinely really solid.
Her backstory is super compelling and genuinely tragic, and you can really feel her desperation as she comes closer and closer to dying, so while she is planning on doing something bad, her reasoning is understandable. And I like how Bill has a good reason to help her, but he refuses to cross the line on things like kidnapping Cassie. That's a really good way of humanizing him. Plus, her ability to phase through stuff makes her a really interesting threat, but the fact that she's in constant pain makes her all the more tragic, especially with how they describe it. Though I will admit that while the scene where Hope's mom is able to restore her body is nice, it also feels like a bit of a cop-out since they could have done this the whole time. Why didn't she and Bill think of this in the first place? They could have solved this issue very easily. I also think the criminal dude is kind of underwhelming. He has some funny moments, but he only pops up like 3 or 4 times, and then he just kind of disappears until he feels like showing up again. So for the most part, I kept forgetting he was in the movie. And when he came back, I was wondering why he was in the movie. So there are some problems with Ant-Man and the Wasp, but I really don't understand why it gets as much criticism as it does, since the vast majority of it is really enjoyable. It's likable, funny, creative, and super entertaining. I think this movie gets way more backlash than it deserves because it is easily the best of the Ant-Man films for me.
Pikachu! Use Thunderbolt!
You know, it's really funny how every single movie in Phase 5 for me swapped in quality. Not good, good, not good, good, not good, and finally, good.
I don't know if I should give credit for consistent inconsistency, but here we are.
On paper, Thunderbolts may seem like Marvel trying to pull another Guardians of the Galaxy, with it focusing on a reluctant group of anti-heroes brought together for a common goal, but thankfully this movie feels completely different in terms of tone. Aside from maybe Infinity War and Endgame, this is probably the most serious tone a Marvel movie has taken, and I think it works really well. All of the characters in this movie, Bob excluded, have appeared in a previous MCU project, and even if you haven't seen said project, it establishes them very quickly, so you can easily get a feel for what they like. Everyone here is clearly in a rough patch, and it's nice seeing them come together and find common ground. They really do dive into some heavy stuff in this movie, and it's played relatively straight. There's a handful of jokes, and to be honest, most of them don't really work, but the majority of the tone is pretty grounded, which I really appreciate, especially at a time when people were really starting to get sick of the quippy Marvel humor. The movie does follow a lot of typical cliches, but honestly, I don't mind them that much because the characters are also likable, even the ones that weren't in their original appearance, like John Walker. And the action is absolutely fantastic and leads to some really cool sequences. Though my biggest issue with this movie is that I feel like some parts could have been expanded on more.
Like I said, this movie goes into some pretty dark stuff, at least by MCU standards, and I honestly wanted to see more of that, particularly with the characters' backstories.
Yelena and John are the only ones that they really go in depth with. Ghost, Bucky, and Alexei have been established before, yes, but I would have liked to see a bit more character moments from them, and speaking of which, Bucky and Bob really needed to be in the movie more. Bucky honestly disappears for a good chunk of it, despite arguably being the team leader, and Bob's arc of going from good to bad to good again feels really rushed. The climax with him trapping everyone in their minds is really cool, but again, we get to see deeply personal moments for some some of the characters, but not others. And I would have loved it if everyone else got moments like this because they could have been incredible. Plus, I'm not really a big fan of the ending, so the main conflict is this crazy lady named Fontaine is trying to kill all of them to cover her tracks, but then she sees Bob's power and turns him against them, and then she claims her plan was to assemble the New Avengers, which is what the team is called, and what that asterisk in the title means. That they did not wait long enough to advertise. Her whole presence feels kind of wonky since her plan keeps changing, and she gets basically no repercussions whatsoever. I know Yelena threatened her at the end, but it still feels kind of underwhelming. So I might have my issues, but I still think Thunderbolts is a pretty good movie. I never got a chance to see it in theater, so I'm glad I finally got a chance to here.
He's so gorgeous, Panther.
I think this was the biggest change, in my opinion, between my first and second viewing that I've ever had for a Marvel movie, and sadly it was for the worst. By that I meant it went from an 8 out of 10 movie to a 7, so nothing too drastic, but I did knock down quite a few slots. Now, this movie was already fighting an uphill battle due to the death of Chadwick Boseman. There's been a ton of debate about whether or not they should have recast him, but regardless, I think this movie made it work well enough. They do a good job of paying tribute to both the character and the actor across the movie, and it really does make for some emotional moments, and they don't feel forced and manipulative. They feel like worthy and impactful tributes to both T'Challa and Chadwick. The movie thankfully manages to make T'Challa's death work as a central plot point, since we see Wakanda struggling to keep itself together and maintain its connection to the rest of the world. Things only get worse when this group of undersea people, led by this guy named Namor, threatens Wakanda unless they join him in a war against the surface. Namor as a villain works well enough since he has a really interesting backstory and clearly has a lot of depth, no pun intended, but I will admit the wings on his feet can look a little too silly. Sure, he makes for a pretty good new protagonist since her struggle with maintaining peace and her relationship with the Queen is really compelling. Plus, I like how it actually ties into the last movie with Killmonger burning the Lotus Flowers, preventing her from becoming the Black Panther until she gets the help she needs. And speaking of the Queen, her grief over the loss of her son is palpably strong. Angela Bassett is currently the only person to get an acting Oscar nomination for an MCU movie, and it is not hard to see why because you can feel her pain and emotion throughout the entire performance, which just makes her death all the more tragic. If there's one thing this movie does way better than the first one, it's the visuals. The effects are 10 times better than they were in the first Black Panther movie. We'll get more into those later, but here both Wakanda and the Undersea Kingdom look gorgeous.
So if you're wondering why this movie went down for me on rewatch, it's because its biggest issue became much more apparent to me. It is way too overcrowded.
There's still a bunch of stuff I haven't touched on yet, like T'Challa's love interest from the first movie making sporadic appearances, which is mainly there for an admittedly powerful mid-credit scene. This tech whiz college girl they bring in to help them, who's an okay supporting character, but doesn't do much until the climax. Okoye being stripped of her title is insane, but we don't get to see how much this affects her as we should. And then there's the whole subplot with Agent Ross going against the CIA to help them, which they keep cutting back to, and then it gets no resolution. Seriously, he gets arrested, they break him out, and that's it. That's all that happens. And all this combined makes the movie go on for way longer than it should be. This is the second longest MCU movie ever behind Avengers Endgame, and it really didn't need to be because so many parts drag. I don't know how I didn't notice this more when I first saw it. Wakanda Forever clearly had a lot stacked against it, but it still managed to turn out something solid. It might not be as strong for me as when I first saw it, but there's still a lot to admire, and I still consider it a worthy tribute to a man we lost way too soon.
It's a whole family of supers!
The most recent MCU movie, and the first of 3 that I've already talked about in my 3-year recap video, so if you want my more expanded thoughts, check those out. The Fantastic Four First Steps is a very simple movie which can work both to its benefit and not benefit. A decent portion of the movie is the characters trying to figure out how to deal with Galactus, and outside of the opening montage and a chase scene, we don't get that much action until the climax, which is similar to a problem the older Fantastic Four movies had.
So why does this one still work despite those issues? Well, simple. I actually like the characters.
They're just sitting around being lazy or spouting exposition in a dark room. We actually get a feel for who these people are. Reed, Susan, Johnny, and Ben are all very likable and well-defined characters. Reed is a super genius who thinks too much for his own good sometimes. Susan is a confident genius who's struggling with the safety of her child. Johnny is a snarky wise-ass, but he's still crafty enough to come up with his own plans. And Ben is the muscle of the group, but arguably has the softest heart. Everyone feels like they have a purpose in this movie, and they're all brought to life by great actors. Pedro Pascal has been in many things lately, and he somehow nails just about all of them. I loved Joseph Quinn in Stranger Things, and he's still great here. And I'm not familiar with Vesa Kirby or Yvonne Moss Bachrach, sorry if I said that wrong, but I would be down to check them out and other stuff. The idea of sacrificing something for the sake of others makes for a pretty interesting dilemma. They have an easy solution to save the world, but is giving up a baby to this giant monster really the best course of action? The line Susan gives about how she won't sacrifice her son for the world, but also won't sacrifice the world for her son is genuinely powerful, and it becomes a great parallel when we find out that the Silver Surfer is only working for Galactus because she wanted to save her own planet. It's actually pretty thought-provoking thought-provoking for what most people would brush off as a simple comic book movie. I also really like the style of this retro-futuristic world they created, which really helps it stand out. Though, like the action, I do wish we could have seen a bit more of their origins since they gloss over it kinda quickly. I didn't need a whole lot, but maybe an extra scene or two since it could have gone a long way. But like I said in my recap video, The First Steps is a pretty fitting subtitle for this movie since it feels like they're building towards something bigger. So I think this movie works pretty well as a way to get people on board with Marvel's first family.
But why don't we move on to the 8 out of 10 film, shall we?
I've been traumatized.
Iron Man 3 is possibly the most divisive movie in the MCU, and it's a shame because I honestly think this could have been my favorite of the trilogy. I think the idea of focusing on Tony having PTSD from the Avengers is great. You don't see something like that discussed very often in superhero movies, and to have it happen to a character that's normally very suave and confident makes it way more effective. A guy like this struggling with his mental health could honestly do a lot in destigmatizing it, and this might be Robert Downey Jr.'s best acting in the entire MCU. He sells the trauma that Tony is going through really well, and his dynamic with the kid is surprisingly really good. This easily could have been really corny or annoying, but it's honestly my favorite part of the movie. It's nice seeing such different people form an actual friendship. The banter they have ranges from really funny to genuinely emotional. It certainly helps that the kid is actually a pretty good actor, and he's very likable too. The action in this movie I'd say is the best of the Iron Man movies. The effects are a big step up from the first two, and we get some really cool and creative fights, especially in the climax where all of these different suits are being operated by Jarvis with Tony hopping in and out of them. This is some really cool stuff, and a huge step above the climaxes of the first two movies. And the comedy is really solid. The whole bit with Tony giving Pepper the giant rabbit is hilarious.
But it really sucks that this movie is held back by some stuff that's just plain stupid.
For starters, Tony doxing himself is one of the dumbest things I have ever seen a superhero do. I know he's supposed to be in a vulnerable place and was provoked into challenging someone, but literally giving away your address on live television is a horrible idea, even if there isn't a terrorist chasing after you. Why would he do this? The climax is mostly great, though Pepper surviving this fall literally has no explanation whatsoever, which is ridiculous. And of course, there's the Mandarin, which is one of the most hated things the MCU has ever done. Now again, I don't read comics, so I don't know much about this guy other than they changed him from an alien to a terrorist, but even taking that out of the equation, what they do with him in this movie sucks. Because at first, he's easily the best Iron Man movie villain. He's got a great setup, a cool plan, and some genuinely threatening moments. If they kept this up, he honestly could have been one of the all-time great superhero movie villains. But then they just throw all of that out the window by revealing that he was just an actor, which is honestly funny, but what makes it suck is the fact that the villain they replace him with ends up being one of the most uninteresting villains in the MCU, and that's saying a lot. Every Iron Man movie has two villains, being a terrorist and a rich white guy, so why do these movies keep focusing so much on the rich white guy? They're never good, and this guy might be the worst of them all because I genuinely have no idea what his motivation is. I guess he was stood up by Tony back in the 90s, and now he wants to control the world's government. How do those two things connect? I genuinely have no idea. And his overly convoluted plan makes things even worse, but he can breathe fire, so that makes up for it, right? Well, no, because he literally does that a single time in this entire movie. It's a shame because the whole serum thing he creates, which can literally turn people into bombs, is interesting, but then they barely do anything with it aside from injecting Pepper, which creates some fine tension, but still. This feels like a huge missed opportunity.
It really is a shame that this movie has so many dumb choices in it, because the rest of it is honestly great.
Again, this would have been my favorite Iron Man movie if it wasn't for those issues, because I think the story, characters, writing, and action are a big step up from the first two movies. But as it stands, it ends up being a really solid movie that leaves me very confused sometimes. A little disappointing, but I do think the hate it gets is way too overblown. Maybe because I'm not a comic book fan, but I don't think this movie should be considered one of the worst in the MCU. Hell, it's not even the worst Iron Man movie. It has its flaws, its major flaws, but I still think it's a really solid and enjoyable movie, depending on how forgiving you are. Also, I'd like to point out that I do not consider it a Christmas movie because I genuinely kept forgetting that it takes place at Christmas until the few times they bring it up, and I went, oh, yeah, it is Christmas, for some reason.
We don't venture out into the void.
I've been seeing more and more people say that Deadpool and Wolverine isn't very good, and I'm honestly not sure why. Sure, it isn't anything groundbreaking, but that's not what I'm coming to a Deadpool movie for. I'm mainly going for a silly fun time, and this delivers on that very well. The action is creative, the comedy is funny, and the two main characters have solid chemistry. Deadpool is a character that constantly swings along the line between funny and annoying, which is honestly part of his charm, so I do enjoy seeing him. And this version of Wolverine is a very interesting concept since he's deemed the worst one across the entire multiverse due to him letting his close ones die. So despite the movie mostly being silly, his stuff is played relatively straight a lot of the time, and it works. The whole concept of anchor beings is both pretty interesting and a funny meta jab at how the only X-Men a lot of people seem to care about is Wolverine Wolverine, so having the universe slowly die after his death works in multiple ways. I really like how this movie isn't afraid to poke fun at both the Fox X-Men movies as well as the current Marvel universe. I mean, Deadpool literally has a scene where he says the whole multiverse thing isn't really working out. That kind of self-aware cynicism is what really makes this kind of stuff work. But the biggest issue people seem to have with this movie is that it has way too many cameos, but I don't really think that's warranted.
For starters, I feel like a lot of people misuse the term cameo nowadays because it isn't just bringing back an old character or actor, it's having a character or actor show up for one scene, usually just for a gag, and then never appearing in the movie again. And by that logic, this movie only really has Hugh Jackman in the opening, Sabretooth, and maybe Chris Evans as the Human Torch, though even then you could argue that doesn't fall into that category because of the post-credit scene. But even if you don't want to apply that and say it's just any old character coming back, you wanna know how many there actually are in this movie? Like, 7. Plus a couple that don't even get any lines.
There's the group of Elektra, Blade, Gambit, and X-23, some of Cassandra's goons, and maybe the Deadpool variants, but I feel like that shouldn't count since it's the same idea as all the Spider people in Across the Spider-Verse, and I'm not gonna flag that movie for the same reason I don't flag this. I'm sorry, that's just something I've seen going around a lot, and it really bugs me. Now, I'm not gonna say that this movie is perfect, because it isn't. Both of the leads try to have arcs, but while they are there, they can feel a little glossed over since they only come up a couple of times before the climax. And speaking of which, the 3-segmented climax is still weird for me, especially since they get progressively less interesting. The Cassandra fight is awesome, the Deadpool army is cool, but the stakes feel lower, and then the ending is kinda underwhelming. But going back a bit, Cassandra is a great villain since she's both funny and pretty freaky. And as for the previously mentioned group, Blade and Elektra aren't entirely necessary, but they don't take away either. Gambit is a good addition since we never actually saw him in the older movies, that doesn't count, and X-23 has every right to be here since her conversation with Logan is easily the best part of the movie. Well, aside from the opening credits, which even on rewatch are absolutely hilarious. I don't love this movie or anything, but I do think it gets a bit too much flack from people. Sure, it might not be for everyone, but I think it's a really fun time, even on rewatch. I mean, it's certainly better than most of the other Phase 5 movies, so that's gotta mean something, right?
It began with the forging of the Great Rings.
Okay, people are really sleeping on Shang-Chi because this movie was way better than I originally thought it was gonna be. I didn't have super high hopes for it when it came out, but I was very pleasantly surprised when I saw it in the theaters, and watching it again, I still think it's way better than a lot of people give it credit for. For starters, it's one of the most unique movies in the MCU's catalog. There's much more of an emphasis on traditional martial arts with some genuinely really impressive fight scenes, like the one on the bus or some of the flashback scenes. Black Panther did something kind of similar, but I think this embraces it a lot more, which helps it stand out.
But I think this movie might have the strongest connection between a hero and a villain in the entire MCU.
Shang-Chi and Wenwu have a dynamic that we've seen many times before, with the son needing to face his evil father, but they really go in-depth with the connection these two have. Wenwu is honestly one of the top 10 Marvel villains for me. His backstory is super interesting, and he has so many levels to him. He started out with ultimate power and straight-up immortality, but he was genuinely willing to give all of that up for his family. That's really interesting. It's only after his wife dies that he gives into his old ways and even trains his kids to become dangerous warriors to help his conquests. But with the way he talks to them, you can tell he does care about them and wants to go back to when they were an actual family. I'm not joking when I say I was fully invested in this movie just for them, but that's not to say that the rest of the movie is bad. Shang-Chi himself is pretty interesting. His struggle with whether or not he can defeat his father is really compelling. I mean, this dude can take out tons of people with ease, as we clearly saw, so Wenwu being the one person he's afraid of both helps him feel like a threat and gives him a really good arc to go through. The movie surrounds itself in Asian culture, and nowhere is that more prevalent than when they finally go to the old village. The place has some really interesting history to it, and despite not being here for very long, the people they meet are still interesting. I really like Michelle Yeoh as their aunt, since she strikes a great balance of being a loving family figure and a strong commanding leader. Though while this movie has really strong leads, the side characters could have been better. Xiaoling has her moments. I especially like how she built her own fighting empire, but I think her dynamic with Shang-Chi could have been fleshed out a bit more. And then there's Katie, played by Awkwafina, and the first role I ever saw her in. Now I know a lot of people can't stand Awkwafina, which is a problem because she's in a weirdly large amount of stuff, and personally, she's hit or miss for me. She's one of those people that's funny when she has a good script, but awful when she has a bad one, and here, she's a mixed bag. She has some funny moments. The Hotel California bit honestly still makes me laugh, but there are some parts where she feels kinda unnecessary. And on that note, there is really no reason for the Mandarin, or whatever his real name is, to be here aside from this buck creature that I can't tell if I like or not.
But if you were to ask me what my biggest problem with this movie is, I'd say this. Remember how I said it does a lot of stuff to really help differentiate itself from the other Marvel movies? Well, that doesn't really apply to Last Third.
Here we go from relatively grounded and impressive martial arts fights to generic schlocky CGI battles where a dragon shows up for literally no reason, and it looks like crap. Seriously, this is one of the fakest looking things in the MCU, which is dumb because the rest of the valley looks great, so what happened here? Now, the idea of Wenwu trying in vain to bring his wife back is great, but he's tricked into thinking she's behind this door full of demons and the fight is just trying to stop him from opening it. That doesn't really feel like something that would happen based on how the movie starts out. And it goes on for way longer than it should given how generic this is. It's a shame that it goes out with a whimper because I think this movie is honestly really impressive. Legend of the Ten Rings is often forgotten about by most people, but I think it is a really overlooked film. Might not totally stick the landing, but the good stuff is still really impressive.
Welcome, new galaxy!
If you were to ask me what the most important MCU movie was, I feel like there's 4 different answers you could give. The one that started it all, Iron Man. The one that made people see how big it could go, The Avengers. And the most successful, well, that's obviously Endgame. But the one that demonstrates how well it could surprise people, that would have to go to Guardians of the Galaxy. Because by all logic, this movie should have been a flop. I had never heard of these characters before, and from my limited comic book knowledge, I think most people hadn't either. And given how this came out at a time where people were starting to get sick of Marvel movies, the first time, it should have been one of those weird failed attempts at making something big that nobody remembered until one of the few people who saw it as a kid made a rant video about it 15 to 20 years later. But no, this movie wasn't just a hit, it was a massive hit. It was the 3rd highest grossing movie of its year, and the top 2 sucked, so it should have been number 1, the 3rd highest grossing Marvel movie at the time, and it is still one of the most beloved superhero movies ever made. Again, based on a source material that almost nobody cared about. But that just goes to show how much power Marvel had back when they were in their prime, and what happens when they actually put faith into their director.
A lot of other Marvel movies kind of blend in together with each other, and you don't really notice much of a difference in direction as much. But this movie, and the trilogy as a whole, feel distinctly James Gunn.
There is no other director who could have made something like this. His style of weird and outcasted characters combined with his morbid sense of humor made for one of the most unique superhero movies of the time, especially since it was more of an anti-hero movie, which just helped it stand out even more. While Marvel movies always had a comedic edge to them, Guardians of the Galaxy was the first one to really put a major focus on it, and it paid off super well because this movie is hilarious. There are so many jokes in this movie that still make me laugh super hard, which you would not expect from a movie that literally opens with a kid watching his mom die of cancer. But the movie's use of strange visuals, great characters, and a fantastic soundtrack make it an absolute delight to watch.
But yeah, one of the biggest reasons that this movie works so well is a lot of the things I've been saying about the other good Marvel movies. It has some great characters.
The Guardians are a great example of an unlikely team-up since they all have super distinct personalities. You've got Star-Lord, who wants to be the suave, cool guy, kind of like Iron Man, though he isn't very good at it since he's an idiot. Gamora, who's forced herself to not get attached to anyone due to being raised by fricking Thanos. Drax, who's a walking ball of muscle that takes everything literally, making him absolutely hilarious. Rocket, who shoots first and asks questions later while also being a total cynic. And Groot, who just does whatever is told of him, which might make him the best character in the movie. Despite being thieves, assassins, murderers, and bounty hunters, these guys are all really likable. Partially because they're really funny, but also because they do have some humanity to them. All of them got screwed over by life and really didn't have much of a choice in becoming the fugitives that they are. But through this crazy scenario, they actually end up being able to do something good. So while their early motivations may be selfish, they do end up doing the right thing and stepping up to become heroes, which is great. And there are some genuinely really good emotional moments, like when Peter opens up to Gamora about his mother, or when Groot sacrifices himself. Plus, each of the actors do a fantastic job with their characters. This movie also has some of the most impressive CGI to come from the MCU. I mean, Rocket and Groot still look great even 12 years later. They honestly don't look that much different from how they did in the 3rd movie, but that's because they didn't really need to. The different worlds they travel to are all super creative, and the Power Stone makes for a really effective MacGuffin, since it's not only an interesting plot device for this movie, but also a great tease for what's to come later. We have glimpses of the Infinity Stones in some of the other movies, but this is the first one to outright show it rather than having it be in some other form like the Tesseract or a Scepter. And like I said earlier, the movie has a great soundtrack. All of these songs are classics, and they lead to some great moments. The opening credits with Quill dancing to Come and Get Your Love is still one of the best openings to any superhero movie. When it comes to issues I have with this movie on the minor end, well, it is funny. I don't think it's quite as funny as some of the later MCU movies, especially the later Guardians movies. Well, okay, really just 2. The side characters like Nebula and Yondu are decent, but they're nothing super amazing. They definitely get better later on in the series, and like all the other early Marvel movies, the villain's not great. Ronan isn't the worst, but he is so generic and so uninteresting. His whole motivation is something to do with his people being wiped out in a war with Xandar, the main planet of the movie, but they don't really go into detail with that, and most of his dialogue is just spouting generic random villain nonsense you've heard a million times already. Also, how the hell was he able to hold the Power Stone without exploding?
But I will give him credit that he leads to what is easily, hands down, no question about it, the funniest scene in the movie.
Unlike the rest of the movie, which is generally very silly, Ronan takes himself completely seriously, which can sometimes get some good laughs. And nowhere is that more prevalent than when he's about to finally use the Power Stone to destroy Xandar, only for Star-Lord to challenge him to do a dance-off like in Footloose, which he referenced earlier in the movie. The confused stares of everyone else is hilarious enough on its own, but Ronan's utter bafflement and him saying, "What are you doing?" is one of the funniest moments in the entire MCU. And it's only made better by Peter revealing that this was just a distraction so Rocket and Groot could shoot him to get the stone back. Guardians of the Galaxy still holds up. It's not one of my absolute favorite Marvel movies, and I definitely think the 2 sequels are better, but this is still a really solid movie that proves what can happen if you give the right characters to the right people. If only the first Ant-Man movie could have had the same treatment.
And we got a civil war. A war down south of Dixie.
Captain America Civil War, or as some people call it, Avengers 2.5. Yeah, I think most would agree that this was the true follow-up to the first Avengers movie. While Captain America is still the main character, we not only have most of the other Avengers involved, but we even get some new ones. And the story seems like a much more logical progression of the MCU as a whole than Age of Ultron did. As I said in that segment, we get to see the tension that's been building up between Steve and Tony finally come to a forefront in this movie, where after an attempt to stop a terrorist group results in several casualties, the team debates whether or not they should be forced to follow the orders of the wider UN. Steve thinks they shouldn't, since they would be giving up their choice to do things, while Tony thinks they should, since it could prevent further unintentional harm, with the others taking sides depending on their views. And this movie does a really good job of making you see the pros and cons of both sides, so neither one of them is necessarily right or wrong, especially since the conclusions they come to make perfect sense for each of the characters' personalities and what they've been through in their pasts, as well as across each of the movies.
This is the biggest advantage that this movie has over Age of Ultron, since it has a story that's actually worth getting invested in.
There's a lot more tension built up between the Avengers, and you don't want to see them split because you like seeing them together. But of course, things only get worse when Steve's old pal Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier, comes back and is believed to be the one who set off a bomb which killed several innocent people, including the King of Wakanda. So now the Avengers are being tasked with bringing him in, but Steve doesn't want that to happen, which makes the tension grow even stronger. As it turns out, this is all planned by this guy named Zeno, who wants to tear the Avengers apart as a revenge for losing his family in Age of Ultron. I think this is a pretty interesting idea, since while Zeno isn't in the movie that much, he doesn't really need to be for his plan to work, since all he has to do is stir the pot and let the others fight amongst themselves.
But like I said earlier, we've got a lot of other characters in this movie. Some could argue too many characters.
Captain America is joined by Winter Soldier, obviously, as well as Falcon, but then he's also got Scarlet Witch, Hawkeye, and Ant-Man. Meanwhile, Iron Man's got War Machine, Black Widow, and Vision, plus newcomers Black Panther and Spider-Man. And this isn't inherently an issue, but I don't think this movie balances them super well, and I don't think all of them really needed to be here. Now, the main conflict is between Steve and Tony, and thankfully they get plenty of time to shine, but the others vary. Bucky is pretty prominent, as are Sam and Natasha, but Rhodey, Wanda, and Vision don't do a whole lot. Black Panther is introduced in this movie, and does have an arc, but he disappears for a good chunk of time, and Hawkeye, Ant-Man, and Spider-Man are honestly just here for the airport fight scene. I mean, we get a scene of Tony recruiting Peter Parker, which also serves as his introduction to the MCU, which is good, but this doesn't happen until halfway through the movie. And Hawkeye and Ant-Man barely do anything. Again, they're really just here to help give us a fight scene. But on the bright side, said fight scene is easily the best part of the movie. They do just about everything you could want to see from these characters fighting each other. And not just as a friendly sparring match or a short brawl, this is a genuine fight between them. And the differing powers and abilities make for some really cool stuff, while still keeping you invested in the ongoing story. Said story is pretty complicated, but it's easy enough to follow and worth getting invested in, especially if you've been following these characters up to this point. And the final showdown between Steve, Bucky, and Tony is a lot smaller, but it's a lot more personal, which makes it more devastating to watch. Aside from some characters feeling unnecessary, my only issue with this movie is that it can rely way too much on the shaky cam. The opening fight with the terrorists especially can be really hard to see, and some of these chase sequences can get pretty annoying. Though thankfully the big action stuff at the end keeps it to a minimum, so this movie still ends on a strong note.
So yeah, Civil War is honestly a lot better than I remember it.
This is the first Marvel movie I saw in theaters, and I remember enjoying it, though I wasn't a huge fan, probably because I hadn't seen most of the other Marvel movies at that point. But now that I have, I can't acknowledge that this is a really impressive movie. It's usually ranked as one of the better MCU films, and I'd say that's pretty warranted. I mean, it's certainly better than the other superhero fighting movie we got in 2016.
It was a raccoon. Huh? What? You ate raccoon meat.
Well, we finally reached what some people consider the end of Marvel movies worth caring about. I mean, I say we still got Spider-Man, but whatever. This is probably the most distinct of the Guardians trilogy, since while it still has a mostly comedic and silly tone, it takes itself a lot more seriously. Particularly with Rocket's backstory, which is just as devastating the second time around as it was the first. He may be out of commission for a decent portion of the movie, but thanks to these flashbacks, you don't feel his absence. If anything, it makes the main story even stronger motivation to want to continue. And the scene where everyone realizes he's okay is easily my favorite part of the movie. You really feel a connection that these outcasts have built over the years, and it's put to the ultimate test here. Now, just because it's a lot darker, it doesn't mean there aren't any jokes in here, though comedically, I would call it the weakest of the trilogy. There's some hilarious moments, like when Mantis makes the guard fall in love with Drax, or when Quill accidentally tries flirting with Nebula, but there aren't as many jokes as the first two, and there are some that go on a bit too long. Like the whole bad dog thing did not need to come back in the third act. Though sometimes this can work to the movie's benefit, like when Star-Lord explains the entire story about what happened with Gamora to this random security lady. That only works because he just kept going and going with it.
And no, it was not intentional that all of those gags I just mentioned take place in the research facility.
The action is once again fantastic, and they really do up the stakes for this movie, which is fitting for a conclusion. And I gotta give credit for giving the characters meaningful send-offs without killing them off, kinda. Peter finally returning to Earth is a fantastic way to end the story, while still keeping some potential in the future to explore him getting used to his new life. Drax and Nebula raising the kids that were created by the High Evolutionary is a great resolution for both of them, since Drax gets to be like the father he was meant to be, while Nebula is able to give them the type of childhood she had stolen from her. I really like Mantis deciding to set out and find her own path. She honestly might be my favorite of the Guardians, and Rocket and Groot get to carry on their legacy with some new members. And if your heart doesn't melt when Groot says, "I love you guys," I'm convinced it's made of stone.
But sadly, my issues with this movie didn't really change on rewatch.
I still think it's a bit too long, especially the climax. When Rocket is saved, I was shocked to find out we still had an hour left in the movie, since that was the main driving force behind the conflict. Adam really needed to be in the movie more for his arc to work, since it doesn't actually get going until the last 40 minutes. And I'm still not a fan of the High Evolutionary, which sucks because, like I said in my 2023 video, I think the concept behind him is really interesting. But God, is he annoying! I will admit he's not that bad throughout the first half of the movie since he's relatively restrained, but in the second half, and especially the climax, he just does not stop screaming, and it is so annoying. Please just shut up already, Jesus! While Volume 3 isn't my favorite of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, it still keeps almost all the elements that made the previous film so special, and provides a great ending to a great trilogy.
Oh, yeah, I never actually saw the Guardians Holiday Special. I should really get to that this Christmas.
Oh, great, the Winter Soldier.
This is considered by many to be one of, if not the best MCU movie ever, and while I don't personally agree with that, I can't see why, since it has some really solid elements. It's honestly crazy how much of an improvement this movie is from the first one. The story is super complex, but it never feels hard to follow. It's really interesting seeing Steve struggle to uncover this crazy conspiracy within S.H.I.E.L.D. The story throws in a lot of twists and turns that aren't super predictable for the most part. We'll get to that in a sec. Like I said earlier, Steve feels a lot more like a leader in this movie than he did in the first one. You can tell he's really grown, and we really get to see him take command in this movie. It's also interesting to see him try and adapt to the new world and interact more with the people around him. And that scene with old Peggy hit way harder than I was expecting. It's cool to see Natasha in a much more fulfilling role than she had in the Avengers, and she is a great companion for Steve. Nick Fury is a pretty cool role too, and Sam isn't in this movie a lot, but he is a fairly solid supporting character. The on your left stuff in the opening is hilarious, especially after watching Endgame. Though I find it really odd how they get his Falcon suit completely off screen. I wouldn't mind that much, but they make it look like they're gonna have to break in somewhere to get it, and then the next scene he just has it. Like, oh, what? Was there a deleted scene or something, or did they just not write that into the movie? Like, at least a montage or a brief shot of them getting it would have been fine. Hydra provides a really interesting threat since you're not entirely sure how involved they truly are, and this movie theme of freedom versus security is really interesting, and something that holds just as much relevance today as it did back in 2014, if not more so. I really like Nick Fury's line of, "I have the courage not to use it," when referring to the super weapon. That is brilliant.
The one thing I definitely wanted more of in this movie is the idea of trust no one.
I think it's pretty clear who Steve should trust and who he shouldn't, and most of the answers are given halfway through the movie. I kinda wish it waited until later since it would have kept you guessing for more of the runtime, but that might just be a personal thing. The Winter Soldier himself makes for a fantastic threat. You really don't know what he's capable of or how they could possibly stop him, which makes things really intense whenever he shows up. Though another thing I'm knocking this movie for is how obvious the twist is. I already knew going in that he was Bucky, but even if I didn't, the face matches pretty well, and there's literally a scene where you can clearly make out who he is. Why did they do that? That completely sucks away most of the weight when he's finally revealed. I really wish they did a better job of hiding this. But possibly the strongest thing about this movie is the action. Like Black Widow, it's a lot more grounded than a lot of the other Marvel movies, which really helps it stand out. Since Captain America's powers lie mainly in his strength and his shield, there's much less of a focus on CGI and more on hand-to-hand combat, as well as some really elaborate car chases and gunfights. All of these scenes are super well choreographed and really intense too. The elevator scene was easily the best part of the movie. Seeing the tension slowly build more and more until it eventually snaps was amazing, and Cap's escape was so satisfying. Plus the climax was really cool too. Seeing them take down these giant warships is as exhilarating as it is awesome. I was also kind of surprised to see Danny Pudi as one of the flight monitors until I remembered that this movie was directed by the Russo brothers, who also worked on Community, and Donald Glover plays Aaron Davis in Spider-Man Homecoming. So, do you know what that means? Troy and Abed are in Marvel. Captain America the Winter Soldier might not be my favorite Marvel movie, but I can see why it is for so many others. It's got a great story, awesome action, some really cool twists, and a solid cast of characters, plus another one of my favorite Stan Lee cameos.
Only the strongest shall rule.
Black Panther is such an interesting movie because when it came out, it was a huge deal. And I don't just mean it was popular with audiences, it was a critical juggernaut. To this day, it is the highest rated Marvel movie on Rotten Tomatoes, and it was the first and still only superhero movie to actually get a Best Picture nomination at the Oscars. Joker doesn't count. But despite all that, no one really talks about it that much anymore, and I don't see too many people saying it's their favorite Marvel movie.
Now, I saw this movie about a year after it came out, and I remember liking it quite a bit, but not really loving it as much as a lot of other people did. Though, unlike the second one, rewatching it actually made it a bit better for me.
Now, I still have some issues, but at its core, this is a really frickin' good movie. Wakanda is such a unique place for it to be set, and it's a really interesting country with a lot of deep history that is fun to learn about. The technology they use is also really creative. T'Challa is a really solid protagonist, since while he is a little basic, I do enjoy watching him grow and become the leader that his country needs him to be. Same goes for most of the side characters. Sure, he gets some really solid laughs, and Nakia has some good moments. Her chemistry with T'Challa isn't great, but it does the job fine enough. Though my favorite side character is easily Okie. She's a total badass, and her struggles with staying loyal to the crown or to what she truly believes is right is really interesting, especially when that comes to a clash with her husband. But none of that really matters, because without a doubt, the best part of the movie is Killmonger. Oh my god, he is easily one of the top 5 MCU villains, if not top 3. Which is nuts, because he doesn't seem like he'd be the main threat. It starts out with them trying to catch Claw, who's already really fun and interesting, but when it's revealed not only that Killmonger is the real danger, but who he actually is, it makes for an amazing twist. Even on rewatch, the scene where people discover his identity is extremely suspenseful. Everything about this guy is amazing. Michael B. Jordan plays him perfectly, his backstory is really interesting, he commands a great amount of authority and presence, and his plan and motivation are actually understandable. He's seen a lot of African people struggling across the world and thinks Wakanda should use the tools they have at their disposal to help them rather than hiding like they always have. But he doesn't think they should do this the peaceful way. He wants them to provide weapons so they can stage a revolution. And that's where the problems arise, especially with the way he treats everyone around him, both allies and enemies. Even going as far as to have the Black Panther plants burned so that no one else can achieve his strength. While he is a power-hungry maniac, he still has a level of humanity to him that gives him some level of sympathy, making him easily the best and most interesting character in the movie.
Though sadly, I still can't say this is my favorite Marvel movie because there are some pretty blatant issues.
To start off with some small ones, a few of the characters feel underutilized. The Queen honestly doesn't do that much, despite her being much more prominent in the sequel. We get glimpses of some other tribes in Wakanda, but we don't explore them that much, and half the time it feels like Agent Ross doesn't need to be here. He helps a little bit during the climax and kinda contributes to the theme of Wakanda needing to work with other countries more, but for the most part, he doesn't really add much. You know how a lot of other movies have a token black guy? Well, this movie has the rare token white guy. But the biggest problem with this movie is some of the effects. Now, Wakanda itself looks gorgeous. The landscapes and waterfalls are great, but the rhinos are distractingly fake, and some of the action just ends up not looking good. The chase scene in Korea is solid since it looks like an actual place, but then the final showdown between the two Black Panthers looks like this. What the hell happened here? I know there is a story reason for why they're fighting on these trains, but this looks like a freaking PS3 game. Marvel movies don't always have super groundbreaking effects, but even this is some of the worst CGI to come from the MCU. There's a reason the second one was nominated for Best Visual Effects and this one wasn't. So yeah, it really takes away from some of the tension of this fight with how bad it looks. Especially when you compare it to the ritual combat from earlier, which are easily some of the best scenes in the movie. While Black Panther sadly has some weak elements, it also has some really strong ones. I'm glad I finally got a chance to revisit this movie, and I wouldn't mind returning to it again in the future.
Are you ready to Ragnarok?
Thor Ragnarok is another one I've seen a few people say is their favorite Marvel movie ever, though for completely different reasons as the Winter Soldier. That one people enjoy for its complex themes and interesting storyline. This one people enjoy because it's just pure dumb fun. That's not to say there's nothing unique or complex in it, but this might be the biggest and best example of Marvel going full popcorn movie.
Which is shocking given what happened with the last Thor movie, but it really feels like they took all of the complaints that people had with Dark World and said, okay, screw it, let's just go all in on having fun with this one. And it works because this movie's a total blast.
While Dark World was as bland as it could be, Ragnarok is bright, goofy, funny, colorful, interesting, and extremely entertaining. This might have more action and fight scenes than any other Marvel movie, and it never gets stale because they're all super unique and really creative. The initial fight with Hela, Thor's fight with Hulk in the Colosseum, the spaceship escape, the final brawl in Asgard, and then Ragnarok actually taking place, all of these sequences are an absolute blast. I'll admit I'm kinda mixed on Thor's characterization here, since this is when he really shifts from being very commanding and honorable to goofy and lighthearted. On the one hand, this feels kind of jarring, and I liked how he was portrayed in the earlier movies, but on the other hand, he is still likable and fun to watch. While it's different, Chris Hemsworth still does a great job at making him likable. He does have some really funny lines, and I kind of like the idea that as time has gone on, he's learned to lighten up a bit and have more fun protecting people and saving the world. So overall, I do think it evens out, but I can understand if some people would have an issue with this. We get even more Loki in this movie, which is great, and his arc about becoming not a full good guy, but at least someone who can actually work with people is pretty compelling. We also dive way more into Hulk's character, which is a nice surprise. I like the idea that he's forming more of his own personality outside of Bruce, and how he doesn't want to return to Earth because people there fear him, but here he's loved and cheered, even if he is just entertainment to these people. The side characters range from interesting like the Valkyrie to funny like Korg.
And we managed to get not one, but two top-tier villains.
Hela is fantastic across the board. Her backstory is interesting, she's genuinely funny at times, and feels like an actual threat. Though I do feel like she's a little underutilized. She's supposed to be the main threat of the movie, but after Thor and Loki get trapped, she very much takes a backseat. She pops in a handful of times to show what she's doing and provide some more backstory to her as well as Odin, but we go some pretty long stretches without her. During the escape sequence, she literally vanishes for a good 34 minutes. Yes, I counted. And I find that a little disappointing. But at the very least, the villain focus shifts to being the Grandmaster, which does work very well. He's a much more basic villain, but he's a solid idea and genuinely funny, so I still enjoy watching him, especially since he's played by Jeff Goldblum, who's just delightful in almost anything. I said almost. Overall, Thor Ragnarok isn't my favorite Marvel movie like some other people, but it is a really fun time. It may have indirectly led to them going overboard with the quote-unquote funny in the next Thor movie, but at least we got something solid before that. And Jane and her friends aren't in this one, so that easily makes this the best of the series.
Yes, dear boy, a man. In a suit.
The one that started it all. Iron Man was arguably the backbone of the MCU, since if this movie flopped, they would have had to scrap everything. But not only was this movie a hit, it was a huge hit. And it got pretty much everyone on board for the shared universe. Hell, along with The Dark Knight, this was what really made superhero movies popular again, and regardless of your opinion on them overall, you gotta admit that was a pretty big deal. And as someone who hadn't seen this movie until now, I totally get why, because this movie is awesome. It is easily one of the strongest first acts in the MCU. Tony being stuck in this cave and forming a friendship with this guy as they try and secretly build their way out is really compelling. In only 40 minutes, we see Tony realize how much harm he's been unintentionally causing to people without even knowing it, but now that harm has been forced upon him. The process of them building the suit is great, and when he finally breaks out, it is one of the most satisfying and awesome things I have ever seen in a superhero movie. Him saying, "my turn," is at least top 5 MCU moments for me. But it doesn't just stop there. It's really cool watching him decide to right his wrongs and do his best to prevent more people from being hurt by his weapons.
Just a shame a real-life billionaire certainly wouldn't do something this noble.
I wanted to save this aspect for this movie because it was the first of the Iron Man trilogy, but I think Robert Downey Jr. was born to play this character. He brings a perfect amount of wit, charm, snark, and regret to make Tony a fantastic character to follow. You really do watch him grow over the course of the movie, but from the beginning, he is always likable. He goes through so many ups and downs of trying to make the suit work, and when he finally does, it feels great. Watching him save innocent people is amazing character growth, and taking out more of the terrorists is extremely satisfying. And I wasn't expecting to be super invested in his relationship with Pepper Potts, but the two have surprisingly good chemistry together, although we all know his true love is Happy Hogan. The action in this movie holds up really well for 2008, and the comedy gets some really good laughs too.
Though unfortunately, the third act of this movie kind of drags it down a bit, the main reason being, as I hinted to before, the villain.
I honestly think it would have been better if it was just the terrorists searching for revenge, since it would have given Tony a more fulfilling and satisfying character arc. But instead, it's just this other rich guy who's built up like the big twist villain, even though it's really obvious he's gonna be the bad guy. His motivation is just money, and that's it. And he doesn't have any memorable moments aside from screaming about how Tony could build the reactor in a cave. The idea of him being in an upgraded version of the original suit isn't horrible, but the fight between him and Tony is really basic and dull. It's not terrible, but it's easily the weakest part of the movie for me. I'd say Iron Man holds up really well. Again, I hadn't seen it before starting this ranking, though I'd been wanting to watch it for a while, and I'm glad I finally did because I had a really good time with it, and it was a great way to kick off what would end up being the biggest movie franchise ever. Also, very important fact, the reason he gets Burger King when he comes back to America is because Robert Downey Jr. ate there one time, and the food was so bad it caused him to rethink his entire life, which is what finally convinced him to quit drugs. And that is one of the best stories I have ever heard in my entire life.
Look, honey, it's Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and Bruce Valanche.
The Avengers, the film that really put Marvel on the map, as well as the first Marvel movie I ever saw. Okay, I only really saw chunks of it at a friend's house, but I was there for the whole climax, and that's the most important part. And watching it in full in 2018 was what got me interested in the wider MCU as a whole. There were a few movies I wanted to check out, but rewatching this made me want to see even more of them.
And this movie doesn't just hold up. It really holds up. Even a decade later, it is a solid, interesting, fun movie.
The story is really basic, with Loki wanting to use the Tesseract to summon an alien invasion to take over the world, so Nick Fury decides it's finally time to assemble the Avengers. Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and Hulk, plus Black Widow and Hawkeye, who were in a couple of the previous movies, but this is their main debut. And that's really all there is to it. The movie is just about them learning to work together and try to stop Loki. This works to the movie's benefit since it allows us to get invested in the characters very easily. Even if you hadn't seen their establishing movies, you get the vibe each character has very quickly. Tony's snarkiness and clever remarks, Steve's sense of leadership and helping people, Thor's nobility and pride, and Bruce's intelligence, as well as his fear of snapping at any moment. Yeah, they use the Hulk form pretty sparingly in this movie, so that the couple of times he does show up make that much more of an impact. We get a great idea of everyone's personality and goals purely from the way they interact with each other. One of my favorite moments is when Steve is the only one who doesn't question S.H.I.E.L.D. since he's a soldier and thus trained to follow orders. Meanwhile, Tony and Bruce are a lot more suspicious of them having ulterior motives given their history with stuff like this. It's a great way of fleshing them all out while showcasing their differences given and both an interesting dynamic for the movie and clever foreshadowing for Civil War when the tension becomes too much. We also really get to meet Natasha Romanoff in this movie, and while she was in Iron Man 2, this is where she feels like a proper superhero. And she's also really interesting since we get glimpses into her backstory, which works well for her motivation in this movie. Hawkeye is also in this a lot more than Thor, which isn't saying much, though he is easily the weakest of the group, largely because he spends half of the movie under Loki's mind control since his scepter has the Mind Stone in it. This does lead to some cool action scenes and a decent motivation for Natasha, but that also means Clint doesn't really do that much, which is a little disappointing. But this is where Loki really gets his chance to shine. Once again, he's hilarious since his motivation is pretty pathetic, but he actually does have some good villainous moments. The scene where he chews out Black Widow is legit threatening, and his plan to infiltrate the base to tear the Avengers apart from within is pretty clever. It doesn't work, sure, but it's still much more than a lot of other villains would try. He strikes a great balance of being an actual threat and an overgrown man-child that you enjoy watching the other characters take the piss out of, or in Hulk's case, slam him into the floor over and over again, which is easily the funniest scene in the movie.
But come on, we all know the best part of this movie is easily the climax.
The Battle of New York was one of the biggest battles of any superhero movie at the time, and again, it holds up surprisingly well. Some of the green screen is a little dated, but the majority of the effects still look good, and the action is a ton of fun. It doesn't overstay its welcome, but it does go on for longer than most people would expect, and they give all 6 characters a chance to shine. Iron Man's lasers, Cap's shield, Thor's lightning, Hulk's strength, Black Widow's agility, and Hawkeye's marksmanship are used at full display here. So no matter which character is your favorite, they all feel like they're used effectively, and don't even get me started on that panning shot which shows all 6 of them.
Though the one downside to this climax is that it was one of the earliest examples of what will become the most obnoxious cliche of any 2010s action movie: the freaking sky portal.
I swear this stupid thing was freaking everywhere, and half of them were all created by the same method of a beam surrounded by stuff. I mean, I kinda see why, since it can either be a dispenser for armies or suck everything up, but that doesn't change the fact that these things were everywhere, and this movie is partially to blame for it. I know that's not really Avengers' fault, but I don't care because this thing just would not go away. Aside from that, the only issue I have with the climax is that the way the invasion is stopped is very much a Deus Ex Machina. The Council fires a missile at New York, and Tony steers it into the portal. It's a cool moment, sure, but I would have liked it a lot better if the Avengers themselves actually came up with the solution rather than it just being handed to them. And while this movie is enjoyable, it also very much feels like a first step, so they don't really allow for any massive character arcs or emotional moments. There are a few, like Bruce learning to accept the Hulk as a part of him, or Coulson's death, which is sad, but it is nowhere near as strong as a lot of stuff in the later Avengers movies, or even other parts of the MCU. But given how this was the first time a major crossover on this scale was done like this, keeping things simple was probably for the best. Because while the Avengers isn't a masterpiece, it is still a really solid movie that I still enjoy all these years later.
Wow, that was a lot of 8 out of 10, so let's finally get into the 9s.
I know that show you wet anywhere. Mary Poppins.
Okay, I've seen quite a few people say this movie is inferior to the first one, and I'm gonna have to call blasphemy, because Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is the best of the trilogy, and it's honestly not even close. This does everything that a great sequel should do. The story is more interesting, the characters are better developed, the action is better, the comedy is funnier, the emotional moments hit way harder. Everything about this movie is a huge improvement over the first one. The Guardians really feel like a team, and even more like a family. The first one was about seeing this ragtag group of people come together, but this one is about why they stay together. And it's not just because they have no one else to go with. In their own strange way, they really do belong with each other. Despite constantly fighting and getting under each other's skin, they will always be there for each other no matter what, and that's what family really is. When Nebula points out how they argue all the time and says they're not friends, but Drax just responds with, "We're family," that is absolute perfection.
Just about every character from the first movie is fleshed out more in some way.
Star-Lord learns more about where he came from since he finally gets the chance to meet his real father, Ego, and we get some great insight into both his childhood on Earth as well as with the Ravagers. And he's faced with a really interesting decision that I think many people would struggle with if put in his shoes. His relationship with Gamora has developed a lot more, and their connection is honestly really sweet, which just makes what's happened in later movies all the more tragic. Groot doesn't really grow that much, but he's perfect, so he doesn't need to. We get glimpses into Rocket's headspace, which mainly comes later in the next movie, but we do get some good nuggets of foreshadowing here. And Drax doesn't grow a whole lot, but I do really like his dynamic with Mantis. Speaking of which, Mantis joins in this movie, and like I said, she honestly might be my favorite member of the group. I do think she's funnier in the third movie, but she's still great here. Her innocence and confusion lead to some great laughs. Even the side characters from the last movie, like Yondu and Nebula, are fleshed out a lot more. We really see Nebula and Gamora grow closer together, and see that despite their horrible childhood, they are able to find solidarity in each other. And Nebula's redemption doesn't feel forced or rushed, especially when you remember where she and Gamora came from. And Yondu was funny in the first movie, but here we really see that he actually does care for Quill. He was genuinely trying to keep him safe from Ego Ego for all those years, and when he sacrifices himself in the end, it's one of the saddest moments in any Marvel movie.
But the number one thing that makes this the best of the trilogy is that it's the only one where I actually like the villain.
Ego is absolutely fantastic. He starts out really charming and funny, which is a great way of luring Peter in, as well as the audience, while giving slight hints that something is up about this place. But when we see just how messed up he really is, it is genuinely really shocking and disturbing. And what makes it even better is that there is levels to it. First, we find out his plan is to essentially consume the entire galaxy, which is already messed up. Then we see he has literal mountains of skulls from other children he made that weren't strong enough to contain his power. But then we get the ultimate bombshell reveal that he was the one who killed Peter's mother. This is easily my favorite scene in the movie because it instantly snaps Quill out of his trance and he just starts blasting Ego as much as he physically can. He doesn't even slightly hesitate. He just opens fire on him and it's amazing. And Ego crushing his Walkman is unironically one of the most devastating moments in any superhero movie ever, which just makes his eventual defeat even more satisfying. I haven't even gotten to the fact that the action in this movie is amazing and the effects are even better than in the first one. These planets and landscapes just look gorgeous, and as I hinted to earlier, this is easily the funniest of the trilogy. There are so many scenes in here that had me dying of laughter. Rocket's reaction to Taserface's name, them trying to get Groot to steal the right fin only for him to keep grabbing so much other stuff, including someone's toe, that same type of conversation happening with telling him how to push the right button on the bomb, and Star-Lord using his celestial powers to make a giant Pac-Man. Absolute perfection. If I have any complaints, I'd say there's some minor pacing issues. Some scenes go on longer than they should, and some get cut kinda short. Particularly the scene with Gamora and Nebula making up with each other. I really wanted to see more of this, but it ends kinda abruptly. And the Gold people don't really make a huge difference as the movie goes on. They're the main force for how the movie starts, but they don't really do much after that. They just show up a few more times to remind you they exist. I know they end up being more important for the third one, but even then they feel kinda sidelined, which makes it even weirder. But that's really all I got. I freaking love this movie. It is easily my favorite of the Guardians movies, and I think it deserves way more love than it gets. I mean, it gave us Yondu saying, "I'm Mary Poppins, y'all," and really, what more could you possibly want?
Hey, welcome to Homecoming. Before you go, just to let you know, you can get, as some would put it, drunk.
I love Spider-Man Homecoming. In fact, I love it so much I did a full review on it a few months ago, but I still watched it again as part of this marathon because I love it that much.
This was easily my favorite MCU movie when I first saw it, and my favorite Spider-Man movie at the time.
Spider-Man is easily my favorite superhero, so it's not surprising that I put it this high on the list, and this movie really showcases why. It's a much simpler story than a lot of the other Marvel movies, but it works really well because of how charming and fun it is, and how likable the characters are. Peter is a really endearing protagonist. He strikes a perfect balance of being a relatable, awkward nerd during his personal life, and being a cocky smartass once the suit goes on. His writing is fantastic, and Tom Holland absolutely nails the character. I love the dynamic he has with both Ned and May, and you really want to see things work out with him and Liz, which sadly doesn't end up happening. Tony is a pretty strong mentor figure, and actually serves a big purpose to the movie rather than just being a cheap cameo or something. I really like seeing Peter grow as a hero and as a person, and his arc about learning to become his own hero while also not taking the little things in life for granted is great. But a hero is only as strong as his villain, and Vulture is easily one of the best villains in the entire MCU. You can clearly see where he's coming from, since he was just a common working man trying to support his family, but after he got screwed over, he was forced to turn to more nefarious methods by building these dangerous weapons and selling them to criminals. You really see him grow more and more dangerous as the film goes on, and he becomes more and more desperate. And Michael Keaton is both hilarious and honestly kinda terrifying. I've seen this movie like 5 times at this point, and I still can't watch the scene in the car without cringing. We had some pretty cool action sequences, like the truck chase, stopping the elevator, and the battle on the ferry, and this movie is absolutely hilarious. There are so many gags that still make me laugh just as hard as I did when I first saw it. Peter not being able to swing through the field since there's nothing to latch onto, Shocker's death and Vulture's earnest reaction to his mistake, Flash asking Spider-Man if he's friends with Peter Parker after he falls down the elevator shaft, the teacher revealing he's already lost students on a past field trip, and Ned getting busted in the library. All of these scenes are freaking hysterical. And easily my favorite scene in the movie is when Peter's trapped under the rubble. Not only are his cries for help chillingly real, but when he looks at his mask and realizes that his true strength comes from himself rather than the suit, it's an amazing moment that makes his escape from the rubble that much more satisfying. Though, like I said in my review, the final battle with Vulture is a little underwhelming since it feels pretty basic and it's kinda hard to see what's going on, but that's really about it. I think the rest of this movie is amazing.
Of course, all of this is just my abridged thoughts on the movie. If you want my more in-depth thoughts, you can watch my review of it.
But for now, I'll just end it off by saying Spider-Man Homecoming is criminally underrated, and somehow the Spider-Man Home trilogy would only get better from here, especially since they don't screw up time gaps anymore. This takes place 4 years after the first adventure, not 8.
Hey, these are rocks. Why is your suitcase full of rocks?
Avengers Infinity War was one of the biggest gambles of the entire MCU. The first two Avengers movies were big, but they are nothing compared to this. Pretty much everything that came before it was building up to this moment, and it did not disappoint at all, because this is one of the best superhero movies I've ever seen in my life.
It's crazy because you'd think it would suffer from similar issues as the previous Avengers movies in Civil War, with feeling overcrowded at times, but it surprisingly doesn't, and I think the main reason for that is because, unlike those movies, this one doesn't introduce any new heroes to the franchise.
While Black Widow and Hawkeye were in Iron Man 2 and Thor, the Avengers were when they actually mattered to the story, especially Hawkeye. Age of Ultron introduced Scarlet Witch, Vision, and Quicksilver, who immediately died, and Civil War introduced Black Panther and Spider-Man, on top of bringing Ant-Man into the main group. But Infinity War doesn't do that. Every hero in this movie was in at least one, if not several, previous MCU movies with a major leading or supporting role. None of them feel underdeveloped because we already know them all by this point, so even the ones that aren't as prominent feel well-defined and like they actually matter to the overall story, which is impressive considering just how many of them there are. You got all of the current Avengers, the ones that went rogue, except for Hawkeye and Ant-Man, some new recruits, and the Guardians of the Galaxy, all of which have varying levels of screen time, but they all contribute to the story in some way and have fairly prominent moments. They spend the majority of the movie split into three groups: Iron Man, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, Star-Lord, Drax, Mantis, and later Nebula stuck on Titan, Thor, Rocket, and Groot trying to build Thor a new weapon after he lost his hammer, and everyone else on Earth trying to find a way to get the Mind Stone out of Vision without killing him. Plus Gamora also gets captured, and things don't go well for her, but more on that later. This is all quite a bit to keep track of, but it works for three main reasons. One, like I said, the characters are all well-defined and likable. Even the ones I wasn't a huge fan of work really well here, since everyone has great chemistry and dialogue with each other. It's really fun seeing some of these characters finally come together. Two, the movie is just overall really entertaining. The action scenes are a ton of fun, and the comedy is hilarious. There are so many scenes in here that still make me laugh. And three, which is the most important of all, they're all linked together by one thing: the main villain of the movie, as well as the biggest threat to the entire MCU, and possibly the greatest villain in any superhero movie I've ever seen, Thanos.
This guy is honestly one of the best movie villains I have ever seen in my entire life.
I mean, for starters, the CGI on him is some of the most impressive I've ever seen. Like, he's on par with something like Gollum or Davy Jones. It's that good. But he's also a fascinating character. He's such a simple idea of a guy who feels like the universe has become too corrupt and people are starving, so he believes the best course of action is to collect all 6 Infinity Stones and use their power to wipe out half of all life. We've definitely seen villains like this before, but Thanos just feels so uncomfortably real and honestly human. Despite doing so much horrible stuff, he genuinely believes that what he's doing is right for everyone. His own planet was destroyed by the very thing he's trying to prevent, and he's willing to go to the most extreme lengths in order to get it. And nowhere is that more prevalent than when he gets to the Soul Stone. In order to get it, he must sacrifice someone he loves, and Gamora initially thinks that's impossible since he doesn't love anyone. But it turns out he does. Her. Despite all the pain he caused her and all the horrible stuff he made her do, deep down, he actually did care about her. If anything, she was the only person who ever did care about, but he still sacrifices her to get the stone because he thinks that's what needs to be done to ultimately save the universe. It really adds an interesting level of depth to his character that you don't often see in villains, especially ones trying to do something like this. But on top of all that, he still feels like a genuine threat. The Infinity Stones aren't just some object that he needs to achieve his goal. With every single one, he grows more and more powerful and dangerous. The movie opens with him already having the Power Stone. That was already something super dangerous in Guardians of the Galaxy, and he got it without them even knowing it. But then as he gets the other ones, it gives him more abilities and makes stopping him seem more and more impossible. The Space Stone lets him create portals, allowing him to go anywhere with ease. The Reality Stone renders some of their attacks useless. The Soul Stone, okay, this one's abilities don't really add anything major. And the Time Stone ends up being the most crucial one to his plan. Everything just keeps building and building, and even when Iron Man and pals almost get the gauntlet off him, Star-Lord snaps when he finds out about Gamora letting him get away. And the Battle of Wakanda is absolutely epic. Almost everyone gets some great moments, with the highlight easily being Thor's entrance with his new axe.
But all of this just makes the emotional roller coaster at the end hit as hard as it possibly can.
Thanos showing up and taking everyone down with ease is jaw-droppingly intense. Vision tells Wanda she's out of time and has to destroy the Mind Stone, which she does. But then Thanos turns back time to resurrect him and then kill him again by ripping the stone out of his head. He's finally got all 6. But then Thor comes flying in and hurls his axe directly into Thanos' chest. But he should have gone for the head. Yeah, the craziest thing to set Thanos apart from other major villains is that he's one of the few to actually freaking win. The snap is possibly the most effective moment in the entire MCU. The different characters slowly turning to dust is one of the most chilling things I've ever seen, especially when you watch it for the first time and have no idea who's gonna die next, with the last one obviously being the most effective. But the cherry on top is after it happens, and everyone just has this look of, now what do we do? And if you want further proof that Thanos is the real main character of the movie, not only is the final shot of him watching the sunrise, as he said he would do earlier, but after the credits, when it's normally says the main hero will return, here it says, Thanos will return. Mic drop. Avengers Infinity War is just as amazing now as it was back when it first came out. I guess if I had to nitpick, Vision feels a little underutilized, and Nebula just shows up during the Thanos fight. I kinda wish she joined them earlier when they were planning everything, since it would have given her some more time to bounce off of the others. Also, this line from Quill is funny, but it doesn't really work since he already said his mother was from Earth back in Guardians 2. But those are pretty minor, since this is one of my favorite superhero movies ever made. I absolutely love Infinity War, and I wasn't sure how they'd be able to top this, but that's a question that'll be answered in a bit.
A human girl, so far from home.
If you thought I loved Spider-Man Homecoming, wait till you hear how much I love Far From Home. This movie needs way more love because I think it is amazing. It gets a weirdly large amount of backlash from some people, and by that I mean Raimi fanboys, but frankly that's stupid because I love this movie. While Homecoming was relatively lighthearted for the most part, Far From Home takes things a bit more seriously while still having some fun moments.
It serves as the follow-up to Endgame, as well as the true finale to the Infinity Saga, though really, Endgame was the finale and Far From Home was the epilogue, but whatever, this movie's fantastic.
It's interesting seeing Peter cope with everything he had to endure in the Avengers movies and struggle to live up to the mantle that was left by Iron Man. And you really feel bad watching his summer vacation essentially get hijacked by Nick Fury and Mysterio, but watching him step up and become the hero they need him to be is great. I really like watching his relationship with MJ grow, and I will admit this feels like a bit of a jump from the last movie, but that's probably my only issue. Ned and Betty's relationship is hilariously rushed, which is the point, so it's great, and Mysterio makes for a great villain. I do slightly prefer Vulture, but he's still really good. His backstory with Tony stealing his tech and firing him is really clever, and a good tie-in to a seemingly unimportant scene in Civil War. His plan is actually really smart, and I like how he brings in a bunch of other people that also had beef with Tony. Honestly, the thing with the Elementals is a genuinely interesting plotline on its own, which makes the twist that it was all an illusion all the more effective. The different locations the movie takes place in lead to a really fun variety of action scenes. The water fight in Italy, the fire monster in Vienna, and the final showdown in London are all a ton of fun. But probably the strongest aspect of the movie is just Mysterio's illusions as a whole. The effects on these are impressive, and they really do mess with your mind and have you questioning what's real and what's not. The best part of the movie is easily when he sends Peter through a bunch of them and really torments him with his insecurities. It's visually stunning and leaves a very clear effect on him. When he breaks down to Happy about how much he failed, you really feel his sense of failure, and it's honestly kinda heartbreaking. Tom Holland was already great in the last movie, but here he really amps it up, and it's fantastic. But all this just makes the final confrontation with Beck all the more satisfying, like when he jumps through the illusions to fight the drones head on, or when he's able to fend them off without his webs, and best of all, when he sees through Beck's deception. God, that is satisfying. Plus, this has what is easily the most impactful post-credit sequence in the MCU, and that's saying a lot. But let me tell you, this was a phenomenal way to get me hyped for the next movie. While there are maybe some minor issues, I absolutely love Spider-Man Far From Home. I know I said Homecoming was underrated, but this movie is even more underappreciated because I think it is absolutely amazing. It's a great sequel to an already great movie that I cannot get enough of. And don't worry, I do plan on doing a full review of it at some point, but that's a project for another day. Lord knows this video took a lot out of me already.
Oh yeah, and the whole copyright thing has been extremely annoying.
We're in the endgame now.
Here it is, Avengers Endgame. The culmination of everything the MCU was building up to at that point. The final conclusion of the Infinity Saga, kind of. 3 phases, 22 movies, and 11 years worth of build-up. It's really hard to emphasize just how much hype this movie generated when it first came out. I still vividly remember watching that trailer for the very first time and just being blown away while still being unbelievably hyped for the movie. I was a sophomore in high school, and it was honestly pretty rare that there was a movie that almost everyone seemed to be talking about, but I mean everyone was ready for this movie to deliver one of the biggest cinematic experiences ever. And it didn't just deliver, it blew it out of the freaking atmosphere, garnering tons of praise, so much buzz, and even taking the title of the highest grossing movie of all time, which seemed unbeatable by Avatar for a decade at that point. And while Avatar did end up taking it back because of a re-release a couple years later, that doesn't take away from just how big of a deal Endgame was. This honestly might be the biggest movie event I have ever seen in my life, and that really is the best way to describe this movie. It was an event. It wasn't just the next big step or a huge follow-up, it was the conclusion to the biggest overarching storyline in the entire history of film. There were so many possibilities for this movie going wrong, but thankfully it didn't, because it delivered what was easily the best experience I ever had in a movie theater and was the final big push to get me to actually see more movies in theaters as an adult.
But I think that's enough talking about the hype, so why don't we actually talk about the film itself?
Well, the movie can essentially be broken up into 3 sections, one for each hour. The first section is the aftermath of Infinity War, showcasing how everyone reacted to the snap, which is definitely the most varied section since we get quite a few different ideas. First, we get Iron Man and Nebula trying to get back to Earth since they were stranded on Titan, which makes her a really strong opening. Even if you know they're gonna get back, we see Tony especially so broken and struggling that it is genuinely chilling. But then Captain Marvel saving them provides a great sense of relief. Then we see them track down Thanos and discover he destroyed the stones, so Thor corrects his mistake, which is absolutely hilarious.
What did you do? I went for the head.
And then we cut to 5 years later to see how everyone is coping after the snap. It really takes its time to show the different ways people are reacting in both positive and negative ways. We see that Tony has a family now, and Bruce has fused his brain with Hulk's body, but Clint has become a rogue assassin, and Steve is leading a support group for people who lost their loved ones. Some people might say this feels too dragged out, but I think this works really well. I mean, this is coming right off of the heels of one of the darkest moments in any major blockbuster, so seeing the aftermath of that is crucial to this movie being as impactful as it is. But everything changes when Ant-Man suddenly returns from the quantum realm and tells everyone that time travel might be possible.
And I'd like all of us to take a second to thank the true hero of this movie, the rat that flipped that switch.
After some tinkering, we shift to the next section, which is the remaining heroes traveling to different time points and reclaiming the Infinity Stones. I think this is a really clever way to give us a fun new adventure that sticks out from the previous Marvel movies while also giving some fan service by bringing out elements from said previous movies in a new and cool way. We get a solid variety of characters going to movies they were in and movies they weren't in, and all of these are both hilarious and sweet. We get some comedic moments like War Machine knocking out Star-Lord, or the iconic "that is America's ass," and some solid emotional moments too, like Thor getting to say goodbye to his mother or Tony reuniting with his father. Both of these use the time travel concept in really solid ways, but the section also has 2 of the more contentious aspects of the film. One is that the Thanos they end up having to deal with is a past version of Thanos and not the same one from Infinity War since, like I said, Thor learned from his mistake. Now, on the one hand, that does make the final fight with him a bit less emotional, but I think it works for 2 reasons. The first is that using the stones not once, but twice took a lot out of Thanos, so he wouldn't be at full power when fighting them. He literally says it almost killed him. And the second is, like I said, Thor decapitating him was the right decision, and not just because it was funny. This dude literally wiped out half of the universe, so if you can just easily kill him right then and there, you killed the bastard right then and there. I guess they could have had him be resurrected later, but still, I think this works fine enough. Though, the other thing is Black Widow's death, and I'm extremely mixed on this. On the one hand, sacrificing herself for the Soul Stone is a noble reason, and it has an amazing build-up with her and Hawkeye both fighting to sacrifice themselves. When I first saw this, I legit had no idea which one of them was gonna go. But on the other hand, this does feel a little anticlimactic, especially when you compare it to the other send-offs this movie gives. And what makes it even weirder is that, like I said, her solo movie came later, and that was a prequel, so that's kind of her send-off too. It's weird. I think on its own this moment works, but in the long run, it's kind of an underwhelming death. But luckily, the final segment makes up for that, and then some. After Hulk uses the stones to bring everyone back, a past version of Nebula opens up a portal to bring Thanos and his army into the present. And the combination of these 2 sides leads to the ultimate final battle of the Infinity Saga.
This is one of the greatest climaxes in movie history, and it's not even close.
Even before the battle properly starts, we get some of the best moments in the movie. Thanos launches a giant attack, reducing their HQ to rubble, which is chillingly strong. A clash for the stones ensues, resulting in Cap actually picking up Thor's hammer, which is incredible. And when all hope seems lost, he gets a call from Sam, and a portal opens. Then, several portals open as everyone who got snapped in the last movie, as well as tons of characters from the past, step through, all of which culminates in Steve finally uttering this line.
Avengers!
Assemble.
This is the single best moment in the entirety of the MCU. It hypes you up for what ends up being a bigger battle than I thought possible. Just about every single major character from this entire saga shows up, and all of them get their chance to shine. The only ones that don't are Vision and Black Widow because, well, they're still dead, and Hulk because he's recovering from the snap. But everyone else is here, and they get some amazing moments that range from hilarious to heartwarming to epic. Star-Lord finding past Gamora and her kicking him in the nuts, Iron Man finally giving Spider-Man that hug he promised earlier, Spider-Man activating instant kill, everyone passing the stones around, and Captain Marvel flying through Thanos' ship like that one scene with Kirby and the subspace emissary. Oh my god, everything about this entire sequence is perfection. Okay, the shot here feels a little forced, but the action that follows is still awesome, so who cares? This entire sequence is just one giant ride that's as epic as it is intense. I am not even joking. When I first saw this in theaters, I actually stood up and screamed in excitement. And I did it again on this rewatch. It's that amazing. But this all builds up to Tony ultimately sacrificing himself to snap away Thanos' armory, which is simultaneously one of the most badass and emotional deaths I have ever seen in a movie, and an absolutely perfect end to his character.
And the very end of this movie is great. Though it does bring up another issue.
Steve goes to bring the stones back to the rightful place, but rather than returning them, he goes back to the 40s to be with Peggy. Now, this is a really nice moment, but it brings up a bit of a continuity error. They specify that changing the past doesn't change the future. It creates an alternate timeline, which is fine enough on its own, but we then see Steve not come back through the portal as if he was already there. Did he just come back at another point or something? Because he shouldn't have been able to do this. So, yeah, there's some small issues, but they do not bring down the movie for me. Whether you want to admit it or not, Avengers Endgame is one of the most impactful movies ever made. It really was the culmination of everything the MCU was building up to at that point, and it delivered a movie that was funny, emotional, insightful, chilling, and downright epic. Despite its long run time, I wasn't bored by a second of this movie. It is some of the fastest 3 hours I've ever experienced in my life. I absolutely love this film, and it will always hold a special place in my heart.
But there is still one movie that I do consider superior to this. We're actually done with the 9 out of 10s now, which I'm just now realizing all came from Phase 3, so now we can finally end it off with the MCU's Perfect 10.
I've seen a lot of people say that this movie isn't as good on rewatch, especially if you're not in a theater with a cheering crowd, but I've seen this movie 4 times now, and I still love it just as much. Am I doing something wrong? Yeah, I'm not joking. This is my favorite superhero movie of all time. Not just the MCU, but across all of Marvel and even outside of it. I love it that much. Much like Endgame, I vividly remember the hype for this movie before it came out, and also much like Endgame, it didn't just deliver, it more than succeeded.
Though in the past few years, I've seen this movie get some criticism for being tied too much to the pre-MCU Spider-Man movies, but here's the thing. While this movie uses nostalgia, it doesn't rely on it.
The use of the characters from the original trilogy and the Amazing Duology isn't just to get people to point and say, I remember that. It's because it actually helps the story that this movie is trying to tell. Because even if you take the stuff out of the equation, the movie is great. Remember what I said about Far From Home's post-credit scene? Well, this picks up right where it left off, with Peter's identity being revealed to the public and Mysterio claiming he was attacked by him. This is a big deal, and I love seeing how it affects not just Peter, but the people around him as well. And we get a fun Daredevil cameo out of it. But anyways, I really like how we see that while some people have turned on Peter, not all of them have. The protesters outside the school are both for and against him, which feels realistic and shows that not all hope is lost, but even some of his teachers are against him, which shows things are still dire. And it affects him even more when he and his friends are ejected from every college they apply to, which is when he goes to Doctor Strange to ask for help. I love how he isn't just doing this because his life got screwed up, his friends' lives did too, simply by being close to him. And his main motivation is to help them, which shows how selfless he really is.
Remember, all of this is before there is even a single mention of a past character, Daredevil excluded, and I am 100% invested in all of this.
I'm not just squirming in my seat begging for the villains to show up, I do want to see Peter and his friends get through this, and like the previous movies, I just enjoy watching them all together. But when the villains from other universes do show up, things really start to go down. We've got the Green Goblin from Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus from Spider-Man 2, Sandman from Spider-Man 3, the Lizard from The Amazing Spider-Man, and Electro from The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Each one of them has a different level of importance, but for what they are, I think all of them work. Obviously, Green Goblin is the most important, and probably the highlight of the movie. As much as I loved Willem Dafoe in the original Spider-Man, he was so hammy and over the top that it was kind of hard to take him seriously, which worked for the style that movie was going for, but this one is a lot more grounded and serious. And my god, does it work, because they really flesh out the two different personalities of the character. We see Norman Osborn struggle with the goblin inside of him, and he genuinely does want help. It's crazy seeing such a psychotic character be so vulnerable, but when the goblin does come out to play, he is legitimately terrifying and one of the best villains in the MCU. Doc Ock is the first one to show up and has an awesome fight on the bridge, and I really like how he's the first one to be cured, since he was arguably the most redeemable villain in the bunch. Plus, he even helps out at the end, which is really nice. Electro is a massive improvement from how he was before. I didn't hate him in Amazing Spider-Man 2 like most people did, but either way, he is much better here, since he is simple in that he wants power and to not die, but he works well enough, and like the Goblin, is much more grounded than his original incarnation. Sandman is just kinda there for the most part, but honestly, calling him a villain in this movie is pretty debatable. Unlike the others, he's the only one that actually wants to go home so we can see his daughter again, and I like that they don't regress his character from the original movie, since he was easily the best part of Spider-Man 3. And then there's the Lizard, who's definitely the weakest, and honestly doesn't really need to be here, but I guess you can't have characters from every movie except one. He's mainly just there to be another threat. Hell, he spends the middle chunk of the movie hiding in the truck, but he doesn't take away from anything either, so I can give it a pass. Regardless of relevance, it is cool actually seeing all these different villains interact with each other, and Peter deciding to actually help all of them is a really interesting and noble concept. But his morality is put to the ultimate test when the Goblin ends up killing Aunt May in one of the most heartbreaking moments in any superhero movie I've seen. Peter loses arguably the most important person in his life. It is by far the lowest moment we've seen him in at this point. Hell, it might be the lowest point we've seen any movie Spider-Man in, maybe this excluded. The scene on the rooftop is easily my favorite moment in any Spider-Man movie. I especially love how Ned and MJ comfort him first, and then the other two Spider-Men show up. Speaking of which, yeah, both Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield come back, and like the villains, it isn't just for a quick cameo. They really feel like an integral part of the story, because when Peter, Tom Holland Peter, is willing to send all of the villains back to die, the others convince him that that won't make things right. They share with him their lowest moments of losing Uncle Ben and Gwen Stacy, and how they don't want him to make the same mistakes they did of giving into their anger and grief. And this is what gives him the motivation he needs to do the right thing and help these people. All of this leads into an absolutely amazing third act.
Like I said, these guys aren't just here for a quick cameo, they're actually integral to the story.
I love seeing the three of them bounce off of each other and talk about their respective pasts. And since both of the previous series were canceled prematurely, this movie provides them some really nice closure. We learn that Tobey and Mary Jane managed to make things work despite their struggles. During the climax, we see Andrew redeem his past failure by saving MJ and giving one of the most emotional looks I've ever seen in a movie like this. And we get to see both of them reconnect with some of their past foes, like Otto and Max. This movie doesn't just use the past movies to enhance itself, it itself is able to enhance the past movies. But it still doesn't forget that at its core, this is Tom Holland's movie, and he's given the final showdown with the Goblin where he doesn't hold back. You can tell he is out for vengeance this time, and he won't stop until the Goblin, and by extension, Norman, are dead. But Tobey still manages to stop him from crossing that line, and in the end, he does the right thing. Not only curing all the villains, but having Strange commit to the spell to fix the multiverse, despite knowing that he'll lose everything and literally have no one.
Believe me when I say that is only the tip of the iceberg of why I love this movie so much.
I haven't even gotten into how funny it is, or how awesome the action sequences are, or even the fact that Doctor Strange actually goes through an arc, since at first he doesn't care about any of the villains, or even Peter really, but then he is hesitant to cast the spell at the end. But I think I've made my point pretty clear. I absolutely adore Spider-Man No Way Home. I genuinely don't have a single issue with it. While Endgame may have been the MCU's biggest accomplishment, No Way Home is a celebration of all things Spider-Man, past, present, and future. It's engaging, funny, emotional, uplifting, awesome, and powerful, which is why it is easily my pick for the single best MCU movie ever made. And it came out immediately after their worst one. Wow, talk about a reverse Shrek 2 Shark Tale or Inside Out the Good Dinosaur moment.
There we go. We're done. That is all 37 movies. Jesus Christ, this ended up being way longer than I thought it was gonna be. But now, we're finally done, and I can now officially say I have seen every single film in the entire MCU. And to answer that question that I posed 2 hours ago, did the MCU really fall off after Endgame? Not entirely.
They're definitely not as consistent as they used to be, but I wouldn't write it off completely like a lot of other people have. I think if you use the same mentality I had, which was only seeing the ones you're interested in or hear good things about, then you probably won't be as burnt out or sick of Marvel as much as the people who feel obligated to see everything that they put out. Either way, the fact that they were able to remain as consistently good as they were for that long is crazy impressive, and I will always have some level of respect for that. As for the future, I don't know exactly what it holds, but I'm excited for Brand New Day, and I'm at least curious about Avengers Doomsday, so only time will tell if it's time to say goodbye to this large universe or not. But I am exhausted right now, so I'm gonna try to not think about any of these movies again until those later films come out. Thanks for watching, and don't let the door hit you on the way out.